It's a day of education, so I'm sure as when we take a break and when you leave today, you will be running into the education protests that are happening outside. So just a little FYI, be aware. You might run into some of your district folks.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
could I comment on that just for a moment? I apologize, but I want to make sure that we as the members of the community that build and modernize schools in the state of California recognize that one of the fundamental impacts of the state's financial crisis is that maintenance of our schools and custodial services is now optional. Districts may sweep those funds and use them for other things, and that all the work that we do to build schools and to renovate schools is going to be lost. And the investment of the state of California is in danger when we don't fund maintenance adequately. Thank you.
I appreciate that editorial, of course. With me being a school board member, I know it firsthand what it's like to have to lay off people and it not being any fun. I don't think anybody is wanting to enjoy that process. So today, we're still working on, just as a brief a reminder as people are watching the video, if you would like to make comment, if you have a question, as we're still working out kind of like the formalized process, feel free to email me. I have my BlackBerry on me, so if you have a question that you would like to have asked, email me and I will ask that question. When we figure out a more formalized process, we'll let you know, but in the meantime, my BlackBerry is on, and for those of you who are on videocast that want to have my email, it is Lisa, L-I-S-A, Kaplan, Kaplan, at dgs.ca.gov. You can also find my email address on the website for those who are watching via video. So welcome. Reminder, the chair starts on time, gentlemen. Appreciate you being here. And then also what we don't have attached, but just want to give you an FYI, is we did not attach the pending list, but for you to know that we are going to come back and have a discussion of CTE, follow back up on the CTE, getting the legal opinions, the savings issue that we did not finish from February. Actually, it was in January. We didn't get to it in February, and we'll get back to it in April. Depending on our conversation on seismic mitigation, that may also come back for further discussion. It is will be my policy that when we get information last minute that does not allow the public or this body as the implementation committee time to review and analyze, it is going to be pretty much pro forma that it will be pushed to the next implementation meeting or set up for a special meeting if it is an emergency regulation. I don't believe it's a part of the due diligence of us as a public body to bring something to you at 5 o'clock and expect you to be fully ready to have a discussion at 9 o'clock the next day. And then we will also be discussing, so come with your high performance grant hats on in April. We have been requested by Senator Hancock to bring something to the board at the April board. So a lot of our discussion in April is going to be high performance grants. So put your thinking cap on, come prepared to compromise, find out ways to make it work, add suggestions so that there's potentially action that could be taken at the April board meeting on high performance grants. It's very important to a majority of the state allocation board members to get something done in regards to that. And then, of course, there may be other various issues, but just wanted to give you a heads up of potentially what's going to be up in April. So let's get started, as we're going to start with acceleration of school construction projects and funding priorities. How I want to frame this discussion, because it's really not per se a presentation from any one entity, but how I would like to have this discussion is attached in the material was a proposal, as it was a potential proposal for consideration. What page is it? Page 12, which is attachment E, which was a stakeholder proposal. So I'd like to go through and discuss that proposal, the pros, the cons, what works, what doesn't work, I want to address this issue before we start getting into the weeds, and then if there are certain other suggestions that in discussing this proposal it brings up, then we can go into that. I'm kind of allocating that there's going to be about a 2-hour conversation per subject matter. If we're on a roll and we got somewhere we're going on this, absolutely, we can go a little longer than 2 hours. But my plan for today is to discuss this, have a 15-minute break, come back, discuss seismic, and then you guys can have a late lunch so we can get in and get out, and you guys can enjoy your day. So again, want to discuss this proposal, attach pros and cons, and then have, if there are other suggestions or other proposals that that come up, we can have those as part B of the discussion. So let's kind of go into that. So on page 12 of your attachment, it talks about how there is a certain amount of money that has been apportioned, but districts have not come in to get their fund release, and the concern about the 18 months and those on the 18-month list with that money. Will they come in? Will they get that money? And how do we further the governor's proposal of stimulating the economy and getting projects on the ground? And we have used the term shovel ready. So to a certain extent, I might want to turn it over to my colleague from CBIA to help frame the discussion. I would appreciate that. So I'm going to open the floor to you.
I'm just going to kind of give you a brief overview from our perspective and some thoughts. I think it's a great topic, and I think we got it's a classic topic for this implementation committee and this group to address, because I think we really have a problem here, and I think we really kind of boxing ourselves in the corner in terms of some of the policies and regulations we've established over time, and hopefully we can come up with a solution. But the problem is fairly substantial in the sense we've got $3 billion of approved projects sitting in line to be funded. I mean, $3 billion. Out of that, we have about $2.4 billion, which are on unfunded list, and we have about $600 million on the portion list. So when we're talking in the context of the problem, it's not just the $600 million. There's $2.4 billion sitting back there. And so then we've got this apportion list, and within this apportion list, it's matched with about $600 million in cash. So we're sitting here today with $600 million in cash in the bank, and last month $20 million went out. That's it, $20 million. And so that's the problem for me. If you look back at the last 6 months, it's approximately $30 to $40 million a month. So at that rate, we're talking years and years and years before we move out these apportioned and unfunded projects. Then you take a look at the apportioned projects. Okay, if you narrow it down to the apportioned projects, which is about, again, it's about $600 million. I'm giving broad brush, but in that you've got what, $250 million. Of that, that's basically they don't have the career tech that don't even have DSA approved project, DSA or CDA approved, and I know some of those are equipment, but still it's a substantial amount. And also within that portion list, the majority of those projects do not have to start or commence construction until spring of 2011. So we're sitting here where we've got a portion of projects of $600 million that are going to go out very slowly. And the majority I don't see going out till next spring 2011. You've got $600 million in the bank, and we've got another $2.4 billion sitting there on that unfunded list. So how can we move forward the projects that are ready to go this spring now to I mean, if you really look at what we really want to do is I think we want to move that cash out right now. We want to protect the portion on the list somehow so that they're guaranteed to be funded. But if we move our shovel-ready projects forwards on both lists now, we accomplish a couple of things. One, obviously, we match it with local funds so we could get $1 billion in the market right now in terms of building schools that are needed. But more importantly than that, we've got like $2 billion in bond sales coming out this March, another $2 billion at the end of March, another $3 billion in April, May. We've got $7 billion coming out there. But the Treasurer and the Department of Finance is saying, how much are we going to allocate to schools if your demand is $20 to $30 million a month? So I'm really concerned that if we don't put pressure on the Department of Finance and demonstrate to the governor that we really have a need to build schools now, they're not going to be allocating those bond sales to school construction projects, or they're going to be allocating in a lesser amount. So somewhere there's got to be some kind of solution where we can protect the apportion list. At the same time, we can move shovel-ready projects from that unfunded list forward now. And so that's kind of, to me, the dilemma and the issue. I'd love to hear kind of from everybody here and kind of your thoughts, but that's kind of our thoughts. Let's try to get this stuff out now and protect the portion list. I think there's some solutions, but I'd rather hold off on some of the ideas we have until hear from everybody else.
In terms of thinking about financial hardship districts and projects, I think that they require some in-depth discussion, as you've probably all anticipated. But in terms of framing the discussion relative specifically to those projects, we have some concerns about the definition of shovel-ready as it's presented in the write-up. So I don't necessarily want to pick that definition apart at the moment, but I think we need to keep that in mind in the discussion.
I mean, I'll throw out what I see the definition of shovel-ready is basically you have your DSA approval, you have your CDE approval. I mean, it's basically your fund that you're able to file a fund release, which means DSA approval, CDE approval. You have your state apportionment, either on unfunded list or unfunded list. You have your local apportionment and your funding, and you're ready to go to bid. You have a contract to build that school for at least 50%. So basically, shovel-ready to me is you can file a fund release.
And I think the issue with financial hardship districts, there's two of them, but the one on shovel-ready definition is having a signed contract to commence building at least 50% of the cost of the school, and you're usually in financial hardship not going to sign that contract until you know that you can file your 5005 immediately and you'll have a fund release pending. So I think that we don't need to pick it apart right now, but I do think we need to keep that in mind relative to financial hardship projects.
So the projects that we're talking about are on attachment C, or at least the ones that have already received apportionments and have not come in for fund releases, is that correct?
No, attachment C. What might be good if, Juan, can you just briefly go through the attachments and describe again what they are?
Certainly. Attachment C is basically the projects that have received an apportionment. So they actually have an apportionment. The clock, the 18-month time limit is once again plugged in. As most of you know, we did have regulations to freeze that 18 months when we had no cash. As soon as we had some funding available, we made apportionments and restarted the clock. So this list represents the projects that have received an apportionment and are awaiting a fund release.
Does this total $600 million?
No. What's
Not even
attachment?
close.
Can you explain
It's-
attachment B also?
Well,
In addition, after you get through this.
probably we should start at attachment A. Let's go.
Yeah.
Let's you know.
Just to clarify on the $600 million, the reason that this doesn't total $600 million is you have the new approved projects at the last board meeting that aren't on this list. That's $136 million. So if you add the two together, you get to $600 million.
And it's a moving target. That's one of the things we want to highlight because we receive fund releases on a continuous basis. So this, this information is constantly changing. It is fluid. Attachment B is the projects that have received the fund releases as of March 1st, 2010.
So, but can you briefly go back, attachment A, the graph?
This is just to give an illustration of how many projects are going to be meeting their 18-month timeline within the next almost 2 years, just to give an idea of how much, in terms of dollars, is due within these time frames, within each month. Again, what we're talking about here is the 18-month timeline to submit a fund release request. And the fund release request, what we talk about, well, the requirements are that you have had to have entered into a binding contract for at least 50% of the work on the plans, and you had to have issued a notice to proceed. Those are the requirements to submit a fund release. So as soon as a project receives an apportionment, there's actual cash, then they have 18 months to submit the fund release 5005. So this chart illustrates when some of these 18 months are going to be due and the corresponding dollar figure.
Well,
Any questions on A? So
Yes.
Bill, then Gary.
Well, no, I don't have one on A, I
I
have
have
one on
an
C.
Let's start. Questions on Graph A?
yeah, this totals roughly 300 million. on
It's
which
only
the-
through August 2011.
But so there's another 200, 300 million beyond August 2011.
Yes.
I mean, that's the big,
It's career tech projects that don't have an
Oh, thank you.
those are the ones that don't have any DSA or CD approval yet.
So
When
that-
do you anticipate those coming?
It's up to the
Okay.
districts when they come in with
Okay.
those.
When we have discussions, to the extent, can you come to the mic because those on the video can't? That's okay. Just state your name and answer. Thank you.
Veronica Caldani, Office of Public School Construction. It's up to the districts when they come in with those DSA. And keep in mind that attachment C, for some of the CTEs, it will say non-applicable. As far as, us receiving the DSA CDE acceptance. But they can come in, and this list will keep changing. They can come in with their, we could accept their DSA CDE today. So that will change, and once that happens, then the 18-month time clock starts. But as far as attachment A, you're correct. There is some dollar figures not here because their 18 months hasn't started yet.
But you see,
CT.
I think that's really important because this is only representing 50% of the $600 million in apportionments, $560 million. If you add those in and the 18-month, then basically after May of 2011, you have another $300 million.
Well,
So this is distorting when,
Well, don't go there. It's not about picking on OPSC.
I'm not, no, it's nothing to do.
No. It's
It's nothing to do with OPSC.
Okay, well, let me frame the issue on the graph. The graph is representing the
I like OPSC. You guys are great guys. I didn't mean to.
the graph is specifically detailing the 18-month timeline. Unfortunately, we know CTE goes through a different process. It comes to, CDE, then it comes to OPSC, then it goes back to DSA. So that 18-month timeline does not trigger, so that's why those projects are not here. So I think it's valid to mention on Graph A. CTE is not included unless the timeline has, so you're right, Gary, you're valid, but I don't think it distorts. It just actually paints the picture of, we may have to, the next subject after we finish this conversation is how do we streamline CTE, which may be the more relevant conversation, which I think this graph then highlights. But it was never intent for OPSC to distort or not paint the true picture.
My point was not OPSC. My point is that this chart doesn't illustrate the magnitude of the problem. And the magnitude of the problem is if we do not sell any more bonds, no more bonds, it could be up to 3 years before we allocate and apportion all the money in that $600 million lease. And that's why I was trying to say, look at the, we've got a 2 to 3 year window before the $600 million is going to be apportioned out. And that's where we boxed ourselves in the corner with this 18-month and the CTE. So.
Okay. Any other questions on Graph A? All right, let's go to attachment B.
Attachment B does just represent what we've received as of March 1st. So we're received the fund releases we're processing. May not be reflected on the other charts.
So this is the good list.
These are the projects that submitted a fund release.
These are shovel-ready since they've been reactivated from November 4th. So from November 4th, 09 to March 1st, 2010, these are the ones who have submitted. They're 5004, correct one?
Mm-hmm. They're 5005.
Or 5005, sorry. Any questions, Mamie?
Yeah, clarification question. There were projects, then this is a question. There were projects that were held up because they'd already been approved, and then when the bonds didn't sell, then there were some bonds sold, and districts received their funds if they submitted their 5005. So my question is there a group of projects that actually got fund releases prior to this list that were originally held up because of the bond sale?
Yeah, as we sold bonds, we've had we had in 2009 we sold additional bonds, and we were able to have enough for the 2.4 billion that was apportioned prior to the freeze. Mm-hmm. So now we have enough in cash for all those apportionments. So yes, there were some that were submitted that were added as a result of the bond sale. So now we have enough. Before we didn't have enough for the 2.4 billion. In 2009, through the sale of bonds, we had enough to set aside or provide cash for all the projects that received an apportionment. So these projects all represent projects that have received an actual apportionment.
And just to frame the issue a little better, from the bond sale in April, 99% of those bond proceeds have been used. And what was the bond in June? When was that? The other one allocated, or April? Whenever the other one, about 89% of those have been used. The issue is the most recent bond sale and October and November paper sale. Is that we've only got 16%, I think, approximately, of those bond proceeds that have been allocated out. So that's what this list shows of the latest October, November bond sale, paper sale, and projects that have been taken off the unfunded list, who has actually come in this time frame for a fund release.
Okay. So last question relative to that. Is it possible that there are still districts out there that were apportioned prior to this November 4th that have not filed a 5005 yet?
And that's when you relate back to Graph 1.
Okay.
And that's where Graph A comes in place for those that have been and when their timeline comes
Okay,
in.
so if you just backed up the 18 months from any one of these dates, then you would pick up basically the whole universe of apportioned projects.
Correct.
That don't have fund releases.
Correct.
Yet.
Minus CTE.
Minus CT. Got it. Thank you.
And again, it's a moving target because we
Right.
get fund releases all the time.
Sure.
Chris, did you have a question? Any? Oh,
I just have a comment on the list. I think if you look at the attachment B, down towards the bottom, for example, and through the list, you can see CTE that are being perfected, their applications. So you see 5 $3 million allocations. We know that's a CTE, new construction.
Yeah.
Or we could infer, based upon that, there's some 1.5 million CTs. So to a certain extent, it seems like these are districts maybe who had, or what we need to look at is what is it that allows one district with CTE apportionment to be able to perfect that in a rapid fashion. And a lot of times it's due to availability of local funds, previous planning, districts willing to take the risk with their local funds to go forward, even when not understanding that the state may not knowing when the state will have the money. So it's just part of trying to understand what goes on here is that a lot of this is not about the state, it's about local districts and the ability of local districts to generate matching funds remember the economy has crashed locally also. Many districts can't get their local bonds. So do they then shepherd and husband their resources so that they hold back a little bit until it becomes clear whether the state's going to fund this or not? And some districts may have been more aggressive and had the ability to take cash and put it up front essentially to be able to get here. So I think there's a level of complexity here that I'm not sure, or we just need to understand as we go forward. And a lot of it has to do with local districts and their ability to be able to access funds, to be able to act on the certainty or react to the uncertainty of the state's funding share. So this is a complicated issue, and it's not as, I think, as simple as some people are making it out to be.
Go ahead, Rob.
And just to piggyback on the complexities of it, some districts are opting to not build these schools because they simply can't afford to operate them. It has nothing to do with capital front funding or otherwise, but when you're laying hundreds of people off, do you go forward with the operational costs of opening a new school?
And to kind of frame the issue, and I'll put on my school board member hat, which everybody's, I think, aware of, but using my district as a little bit of an example, 90% of our general fund is salaries and benefits. For us, on average, the state has cut us 25% for funding 2 years. Districts are required to have a 3% reserve 3 years out. You know, budget 101, we have no choice, you know, when 90% of your budget is salaries and benefits, to lay off when you have to make a 25% cut. So when you make those cuts, it also, when you add on the economy, the fact that property values have decreased, most districts' budget situation is not ideal, so their bond rating may go down. So even if they had local bonds, Natomas, we've more than likely lost our capacity to go out and sell bonds because the fact of how big of a real estate crash we've had. So even if we wanted to build, we may not be able to go out and sell to have the matching funds to be able to do the modernization. And at the same time, we're cutting district staff and facility staff, so we may not have the appropriate expertise to move forward with that. And then what perception does it present to our local community who really don't understand the two different pots of funds of general fund versus construction, that we're out building while we're laying people off? It just makes us look like we don't know what we're doing. So I know a lot of being a delegate to the California School Board Association, that's a conversation that's happening up and down the state. At the same time, there's many districts that are overcrowded, need modernization, need to expand. So how does that all fit in? But every district at the same time, over 26,000 pink slips are going out this month. And, you know, there's going to be a lot of layoffs. So it's a juggling factor, while at the same time, if a potential bond comes down, there are going to be more payment deferrals to school districts, so therefore they're going to have to look at further bond or bridge financing, certificates of participation, to be able even to pay their operating costs, because if they're supposed to get paid in June, but that delay is not coming till July or August, those are huge hits for districts. That there's 7, I think, different cycles of delays that districts are now experiencing with funding. So when we have this discussion, I think it's relevant that we have a holistic approach of understanding that, you know, we desperately may need to build new schools in certain areas, but the brilliance of the SFP is that districts, you know, have half of the control on this and are allowed to decide what's in the best interest for them. So as we frame this discussion, it's important to kind of think about that as well. Okay. Mamie, then Lee.
I'd like to underscore something that the chair just said, and that is, just because a district elects at the moment not to proceed or not to open something does not mean that they do not have that need for it now, and it certainly doesn't mean that they won't have the need for it in the near future. So I think the need exists and will continue to get more intense regardless of what the situation is for the ability to fulfill that need.
Okay. Lee, then Gary.
I just wanted to say hello. Lee Coop from representing CASBO.
I apologize. I failed to introduce you. That's
all right.
Chair's bad. You know, smack me on the hand. I apologize.
That's okay. Anyway, I'm happy to be here and hope I can represent school districts that are members of CASBO and be a productive member of this committee, so thank you. I just wanted to, again, piggyback what has been said. Another thing that districts have to deal with is school closures. At the very same time that districts may be eligible for new construction and may be shovel-ready and may be getting ready for a need out in a new subdivision or an area of growth, at the same time they may be facing school closures. And it's another conundrum that the public has a really hard time understanding. It just is, I just want to point out, it's just one more thing in the mix.
And Gary?
Yeah, a couple things. One, you know, the 18-month timeline was really something we, as the industry, advocated back a long time ago, 12 years ago. We're a real advocate of trying to put in some time frame in terms of moving projects forward. But we never, in the wildest dreams, realized kind of the economy and what was going to happen in the economy today. And in a way, what you guys are arguing for is that a lot of the schools that are sitting there on the apportionment list right now are probably schools that would prefer to delay a few years, not 18 months, not 10 months, not 9 months. And so maybe this is a way to address both those concerns. and allowing those districts that basically still want to be on the portion list or be funded but need more time to either voluntarily go off or have some kind of flexibility there, and then moving forward those shovel-ready projects. And oh, by the way, shovel-ready projects mean they want to build the school and they have the local funds. Those are part of the criteria for shovel-ready. So some might try to at least give an opportunity for the districts that are struggling and having to cut back or want to delay construction for reasons that have occurred in the last year or two. I mean, if you look at a portion project or project, it's usually a 4 to 5 year cycle. So a lot of the projects sitting here filed for those apportionments or started the process 5 years ago. And so things have changed. And we put in place this arbitrary 18-month timeline. And it was very arbitrary, but it was to move those projects forward. But given this economy, maybe there's a way we can give everyone an opportunity to slow down on the 18-month, if they're on that portion list, unfunded list, on one side, and give the shovel-ready projects that are funded to move forward without jeopardizing that data order. So I don't know. Anyway, that's...
Cesar, Robert, then Bill.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Listening to the conversation, I think everyone has very valid points. From the building trades perspective, given the unemployment levels that we have, we are very much interested in trying to find a solution to this. Now, we do care about career technical education, as many of you know, and we don't want to see those funds being siphoned away for other purposes. But, however, I'm hearing a couple of different things. Districts are concerned that they're going to lose their place, lose their funding, and not have the ability to then build when it is necessary. But, however, there is a need to create jobs and to get the economy going. Now, if we're going to go into bond sales and Department of Finance looks at what the situation is with the current schools, they're not going to provide us with the necessary amount of money because we can't get our stuff together and get those projects out and moving. So I think we have to realize that we're in a situation where we want to get these schools built, and finance is looking at us to say, how quickly can they get these projects out and this money out? So I hope all of us get that and keep that in mind as we move forward with this conversation. Thank you.
Rob?
I appreciate everything that Gary was saying and Cesar. It's just the subtlety of districts making planning decisions today and to volunteer to step out of line, knowing how the game works currently, without guarantees of being able to access the money when you thought you could access the money or need the money, and giving it away to somebody else without any reassurance or comfort level of when you might be able to attain the money and the timelines that were set forth when you made all these planning decisions. I think that's the piece that we need to work on, because I appreciate everything you've said. It's just you're changing the rules in a dramatic way that you're asking someone to volunteer to give up potentially millions of dollars, and so that's what we need to work through.
Bill, and then Dennis.
Thank you. I think that for cash, the fundamental issue is that we believe that the way to get the school construction machinery going is for the state to sell bonds. And the reality is that the state and the Department of Finance and many of the other agencies have created a situation of roadblocking. Frankly, DSA took 17 months to approve my high school at De Anza High, and now we finally got it on the street. $66 million worth of construction just went out to bid on Monday. We have OPSC that, notwithstanding all the great things that they do, it's slower now. They've slowed the process down. Everything has been slower. Fund releases, approvals, everything about the process, and so that's conspired to get us to the point that we are, and now everyone has religion that we need jobs, and we need jobs. That's where we believe that's the case. Part of providing adequate funding, providing clear bond sales at the state level on an ongoing and regular basis when we can have that certainty is what will create the atmosphere. So from our standpoint, this is about selling voter-authorized bonds at the state level to provide the funding that's adequate for us to build our schools, to provide certainty as we go forward, to make sure this works. It's not about going in and changing the rules and jumping projects and cherry-picking projects up based on someone's criteria about whether they're ready to go or not.
Dennis, briefly, and then Gary, just before you talk. So, Bill, are you saying that, and others can comment before, so remember your questions, Dennis and Gary, that if districts knew from Department of Finance that ahead of time you're going to get $500 million out of this bond sale, that we could then go on to our unfunded list, and those projects could start going out and getting everything so that they've got the projects in the bid, even though the bond sale may have not happened, or it takes another 6 weeks before we actually have the money.
And I definitely want to put it back on Chris. No, I mean, I think, yes, we need to have certainty that the funding will be there at the state level. And so if we can get back on a schedule of having regular bond sales and getting the machinery going, it helps to create certainty at the local level. And so that's, I think, where we want to be with this. So anyway, thank you.
On this tangent, Juan, then Chris.
I'm sorry, just to clarify, but Bill, for these projects that we're talking about, the certainty is there, the money is there.
I guess, Juan, what
right?
I'm...
We're talking about the projects
that, again, notwithstanding, why are we here? Why are we here with projects that are stopped and that can't go forward? It's because of what's happened in the past to create the perfect storm, okay? And, we've had a whole series of delays from every single state agency, and now it's all gone down to the local level, and we're all delayed, as we discussed in the beginning of this conversation, because our own economies are in a shambles at the local level. Assessed valuation in our district is down 12%. So what does that do to our ability to sell local bonds and to get the funds that we've had available also? So I think we're coming out of a situation where everything has conspired to stop the machinery that we had set in place to make this work. The rules that we have are complex and arcane, but we've set up a series of rules. We've approved a series of projects under those rules, and for us to change the rules in a capricious way now is not appropriate. And we need to let's look at ways that we can get more funds on the street and then have the certainty going forward.
Sure. Just to respond to what Bill's saying, I don't know that you can pre-assign an allocated amount of future bond funds. If we look at the October sale, the treasurer attempted to sell $4.5 billion. They were unable to sell $4.5 billion, so we'd be selling false hopes at that point. So that isn't possible at this time. Further, if you look at the old process, it used to be done through PMIA, which was basically the state was fronting a loan and then repaying itself when optimal through the bond sales. Of course, given the cash situation in the state, that's no longer possible. But in terms of selling additional bonds, we also have to remember that those bonds are serviced by the general fund. It pays the debt service on those. So there is a constraint in the ability of the state to sell bonds. Just as there's that same constraint at the local level that there is debt service, and that the more bonds that are sold, those are also a budgetary constraint for both locals and the state. So I just want to make that point. So to the extent that additional bonds are sold, there are additional pressures on our local and state budgets. Additionally, within the current bond sales, if bonds aren't necessarily allocated to the school facilities program, they are allocated to other infrastructure programs, so they do create jobs nonetheless, maybe not in the school facilities program area, but they are creating jobs. So I don't want to insinuate that not being able to provide funds to the SFP program won't create jobs. It'll still create jobs, just in another area, to respond to what Caesar's saying. So those are my basic concepts. Now, I think what I'm gathering is that most people prefer the first in, first out method for date order. I think at this point, finance is still willing to state that we're first in, first out. Furthermore, on the list, we wouldn't be able to know what's a reimbursement project, a project that's been completed through the district being able to fund those. We don't know what would be reimbursement. We don't know what would be a shovel-ready project. That information isn't readily available at this time.
Yeah, we do. All right, wait. I got a response to you.
Okay, but let's go to Dennis and Gary, and then we'll come to reimbursement. But
well, no, that was exactly the point that I wanted to bring up. I think in the discussion of funding on this list and shovel-ready, we can't ignore the reimbursement projects. I mean, these are school districts, local school districts that have used their own money to go out and create jobs through these construction projects. They've done their part, so we can't penalize them by not funding those projects. Oftentimes, I'm sure Bill can address this, oftentimes they've borrowed against future projects in order to move ahead with the construction of projects. And those future projects now have to be funded, and that comes from the reimbursement. So please don't ignore or discount the reimbursement projects when you discuss the shovel-ready.
Okay. Gary?
Yeah, I don't think anyone wants to or intends to ignore the reimbursement. I think that's part of the whole strategy. In terms of Bill's comment about drafting capricious rules, that's not the intent here. The problem is, and you're all building the same case, that we have a real problem. And the economy has changed. The economy has changed at the state level and the local level. And we're sitting there on $500 million, and shovel-ready projects are not moving out. And I would like to submit to you in 2 or 3 months, the same problem is going to exist in 6 months. So I would like you got, at least everyone here, if we don't come to a conclusion in 3 or 4 months, if projects are moving out at $20 to $30 million a month, we have to relook at it again, because I don't think things are going to change. And I think it's a systemic change that we really seriously need to address, and maybe it requires legislation or regulations or whatever, but we've got to find a way to move shovel-ready projects forward, and it ain't happening. The two other, in terms of addressing a couple other comments, in terms of voluntary, I think that gets this stakeholder proposal. I mean, one element which certainly makes a lot of sense and I think is doable is that if there are districts on the apportionment list that voluntarily want to pull themselves off, for one, the good of the order in terms of moving other projects forward, but also because they're in that position where they really maybe need more time before they're sitting there, they've got all the approvals, but they're not going to be ready in 3 or 6 months. I think that's a benefit to those school districts. So to the extent we can at least pursue that avenue and maybe open up some money, I think that's, a least course, alternative that would work. And I do know a few districts out there that would certainly want to voluntarily kind of shift off of the apportionment list. So I think that's at least to look at that. And then certainly in data order, I believe that data order is definitely sacrosanct, that whole process. But keep in mind, the data order is related to the apportioning of projects. Once you're on the apportionment list, the data order goes out the window. It's then, are you shovel-ready to build? So shovel-ready to me is not an issue of data order, it's an issue of just when those projects are ready to move forward. With not jeopardizing the existing apportionment list.
So I've got a way to keep us going and then kind of come back to some of these issues. But just one, can you further, attachment C?
Attachment C is the rest of the projects that have been reactivated. Reactivated meaning that they received an apportionment, but they haven't come in and submitted a fund release yet.
Not including the January approvals,
Right. The January approvals were unfunded approvals. So these are projects that actually received an apportionment.
Question on the list.
Go ahead.
Could you characterize the list for us? In other words, what percentages? I mean, I don't see a lot of new construction projects here. I see modernizations, small projects. I see a couple of big schools, not very many. But I just, Mr. Rossi has one. I'd like to, have you done an analysis of the list? Modernization, no. CTE, I mean, I can see some 3 millions and 1.5, so I can tell that those are CTE. But, and then the second follow-up, do you have that information? Excellent.
If you move to attachment D, that breaks down by percentage. Okay. New construction, career tech, new construction, modernization.
Another great chart by OPS.
So any further questions on attachment C?
All right, that's great.
And then so moving, Mr. Duffy, you have a question on attachment C?
No, I just had some general comments on the discussion you just had.
Can we have kind of the discussion and you guys hold on to your questions and then come up so that we can let's get through the attachments?
It's your pleasure.
So audience members, please write down your questions so you don't forget them, and then I will ask you up, but let's kind of move a little forward on this.
As I mentioned to you yesterday, I have a time constraint.
So how about this? We'll take comments in about 10, 15 minutes. Want to finish moving through this a little bit more. So, Sean, you had questions? And then Rob? Okay.
I'd like to hear from Chris. How big a factor is the $600 million in DOF's recommendation on how much money should get funneled to the SFD?
I don't know what weight they put on the $600 million. There's a number of factors that they consider in any of the bond allocations, from leveraging to time to availability of funds. So I'm unaware that's another unit within finance that is responsible for that, so I couldn't comment to that.
One follow-up. It seems like shovel-ready is maybe a factor that people want to consider, and the way that the stakeholder proposal reads, it sounds like they want to introduce that as a factor by letting people monkey with the order on the list. Is there some way for us to introduce it as a factor without monkeying with the order on the list? Maybe giving you the information about which projects are shovel-ready so you can see what the need is without affecting, first in, first out.
And I can tell you, Sean, that's a question I've asked with OPSC, which is actually really time-intensive because some districts may be really honest with you and some may not be honest with you, so you're not going to really get an objective answer in that regard. But I think what you've brought up is, and I've kind of written down, is kind of a procedural process thing of further distilling down the stakeholder proposal. But if Chris, one of the questions I wanted to follow up with you is, how can we clarify, or what can we do to give to Department of Finance to maybe understand the issues a little better of understanding that, 50%, as you see on the graph, actually 49% of the projects out there that have been funded are CTE, which have a different timeline. It's more like a 36-month timeline for funding, so it's not that we're doing anything to have them sit there. It's the timeline of how we've created CTE that gives the illusion that we're holding on to money and money is not going out. But if you look at the April bond sale, 99% of those funds have already been released. So that's, maybe this could be seen as a premature conversation.
Well, sure. I think part of what we have to look at on that April sale is it's being construed as there was a specific set of projects set aside to the April sale. But you had $2.4 billion worth of projects that systematically have been worked down from the earliest bond sale to the most recent one. The April sale is largely expended because of the size of the list itself. So now, as that list gets drawn down, now you have, say, $1.7 billion available for another billion. So you have fewer projects for the amount of money that's there. At this point, the $600 million fulfills the entire list of apportioned projects. So from that perspective, you're going to have every single project come in order to draw down the entire $600 million. That is the structure of the program. That is what the state has apportioned. So in terms of apportionments, we've guaranteed these projects funding, and we've provided project funding for these projects. We have to remember that the unfunded approvals list does not constitute a guarantee of state funding. There is a distinct difference between an apportioned project and a project on the unfunded approvals list. In terms of finance's view, that's very important because the state has guaranteed the apportioned projects the funding at this point. So that's an important perspective from finance.
So just a little bit follow back up, and then Rob, I'll go to you. So would Department of Finance not look on it as favorable if we were to, let's say in La La Land, create this objective, reasonable, districts-like standard that those that may have already been apportioned to say, hey, we'll freeze our timeline and free up this money for another person on the list, whoever's next available going down the list that can use this money right away?
Well, I think that's up to the State Allocation Board to determine the funding priority within that. They have the $600 million. If the Allocation Board wishes to have projects, say, rescinded or placed onto an unfunded approvals list at the top of this list by giving up their apportionment, the State Allocation Board certainly has the ability to consider that. That wouldn't be something that we would consider in funding the bonds. That's not finance's position.
Okay. Rob, Cesar?
So I had a couple, but Chris just brought something up in my mind. So what's to say, let's say we work through all this, and it makes sense, and it's something we come up with a policy or procedure that allows it. What if you have an unfunded shovel-ready project? I mean, if the whole argument is we need to get money on the streets and get people working, why wouldn't we fund those as well? Okay, so great. So I don't want to make any assumptions, but so just to clarify, what we're alluding to here is possibly there's projects on Attachment C, and now we just bridge the gap, projects that received unfunded approvals, say in January, moving forward because they're deemed shovel-ready, whatever that definition might be. So my question, and I appreciate Lisa's comment earlier, it's hard to get a feel from districts. I think it'll be very hard, if not possible, to find out who would be willing to voluntarily give up an apportionment or go to an unfunded list. But I would think, and it was something that we talked about prior to, how many districts are shovel-ready? I mean, how many districts would take advantage of doing this? Do we know the answer to that? And if it's just a couple, maybe it'll get back to the comfort factor that Bill brought up. And then so, too, I'd love to find out when bonds are sold, and it's decided by whomever where those bonds go. Roads, levees, prison construction, whatever. Are those projects moving? I mean, I know that we've made this a big issue here with regard to schools, but I don't have a comfort level if those bonds are even being spent and creating jobs on those other roadway infrastructure, levees, you name it. And then just in terms of the bond sales themselves, I don't know that it's 100% accurate to say they can't sell the bonds. I think it's accurate to say they choose not to sell the bonds because they don't like the terms of those bond sales. But I still think a big question is how many of these projects on Attachment C would move?
I couldn't.
Okay,
To me,
that'd be great.
To me, you've got $2.4 billion on the unfunded approval list. Out of that $2.4 billion, there has to be a substantial amount, maybe 20% or 30%, that would be ready, shovel-ready, in the sense they would be ready to bid. They've got the local funding. They could go out to bid and start construction this spring. So there's got to be a lot of shovel-ready projects within the whole universe of the $2.4 billion.
I just think that's a big assumption to make.
Hold on.
Well, I think we should find out.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
I mean, that's
we
what
need to find out.
If it doesn't, then that, you know.
Okay, we've got Cesar, Dennis, Juan, Lee, then Sean. Oh, Bill, sorry. Dude, you got to stick your hand out this way. You're kind of in the blind. Go ahead.
I do appreciate the comments also from Rob on that one. The Department of Finance does set the priority of which projects receive bond funds, right? And so I think it's important for us to hear from them, see if we can come to a solution in finding those shovel-ready projects without district objection for those that can't go out to build, but that can choose to wait because of operational costs or whatever. In an imaginary, world, I guess we're talking about. But this is reality. We do need to create jobs. Construction, we're at 30% and rising. We estimate that our members are going to be 50% unemployment in the building trades this year because of the amount of projects that are not going out to bid and built. So if we don't get those people back to work, guess what? We don't have a general fund to go out and have a better environment to sell those bonds. So we do need to find a solution. And so if we do that, how does the Department of Finance look at construction in the schools in terms of getting a higher amount? Because a lot of our members build the schools, and actually, it's more of the trades. More trades are involved in building an actual facility than building a road. So my question is, would they look at it more favorably and give us a lot more money?
Again, there's a number of criteria. Job creation is definitely one of those criteria. Leveraging of other available sources, local funds, federal funds, special funds, is another consideration. So there's a number of factors that go into that. It can't hurt if something is arrived at that shows these are shovel-ready projects, this number of jobs would be created. that type of information is always helpful. It definitely wouldn't, slow down or take away from any consideration given to the school facilities program. So it can't hurt in those respects. It's always good to have that type of information if available.
Okay. Dennis?
Well, one of the dilemmas that we have here is that looking at the list, attachment C, if I understand this correctly, I see a project on here that was approved by the SAB in March of 2008. That's 2 years ago. Projects that are coming in now, filing for approval, funding approval, those projects are more than likely going to be shovel-ready. They're active and they're DSA approved. They're ready to go. You have a project that has sat on the shelf for 2 years, if in fact they haven't moved ahead with their own money. There's some things that are going to have to change on that project. So do we put the priority of the projects most recently approved ahead of those that have been waiting on the list for 2 years? I don't think that's appropriate. I think we have to give them some time, a little bit of time, not much, but a little bit of time, to look at those plans, make whatever changes are necessary, and get it out on the street for bid.
I think if we were to come to some point of some methodology, it would be objective. Districts would know the name of the game. They would know the rules to it and would be timeline appropriate. But I think what my understanding of the stakeholder proposal is you keep the first in, first out. You have the list. When a project gets apportioned, there is an option on the table that maybe that district wants. They get an extra 6 months to forgive their place, stay on their first in, first out, and then you move down to the next one, and there's supposedly, if we can do it, create an objective process of establishing what shovel-ready means for that district for the next one on the unfunded list to get that, if they're in doubt, shovel-ready. But that's a lot of what-ifs, but that's kind of I think that's the frame of the issue of how do we objectively do this and create it so it still keeps first in, first out, but also develops an objective standard on what shovel-ready means and how we determine which districts, as we go down the list on the unfunded, are ready to go or not. But that's a lot of what-ifs. But Juan, you were next.
Just on that point, I think it was Gary that mentioned this earlier. Once these projects receive an apportionment, then they can come in at any time within the 18 months to submit a fund release. So they don't have to. There's no requirement that they submit a fund release based on the date that they received an apportionment in that order. Once you receive an apportionment, you have 18 months, you can come in at any time. So there is no first in, first out in that sense. Just want to clarify that. The other thing, and just going back to this whole discussion, I want to bring this up because something that I think we need to keep in mind and talk about. The 18 months is in statute. So how do we get around that? That's one question. We do have regulations, emergency regulations that were created to freeze that 18 months, but the regulations were contingent upon funds being available. Funds are available for these projects. So it's something that we need to keep in mind and talk about if there is a mechanism to do what we're thinking about or what we're discussing to do. How do we get around statute and regulations? How do we do that?
Okay. And then we have Lee, Sean, then Bill, and then I'll take public comment.
Thank you. I have several points, and just piggybacking on what other people have said, maybe what Juan just said, I do want to clarify and make sure I'm reading this correctly. Attachment C are projects that have been apportioned, correct? Yes. At any apportioned.
Apportioned.
They have not received any funds, but and at any time, like what you said, this is not first come, first serve. At any time, any one of these projects could come in.
Yes, and submit a fund release request. Yes.
All right. So they are entirely free to come in at any time right now because there's $600 million sitting there. Okay. So what we're talking about really is what you're saying. We're jumping into the unfunded, correct? Unfunded approvals. That's what we'd be talking about, is jumping over this group into the unfunded approvals.
Or asking this apportionment group to voluntarily go to the unfunded list.
Right.
That would free up money for other people.
Sort of same, yes. Mm-hmm. So So, but I think what I'm understanding is there's enough cash right now to fund these, if all of them came in. So it would be, we jump to fund any more, it'd be going to the unfunded approvals list. Okay. To me, that seems like a huge jump, huge change in the rules for districts. These folks, these districts have their 18 months. They have their time. They're playing by the rules that we set up. And like them, hate them, love them, we're playing by the rules. And the only thing consistent on that is that 18 months. We'd love to keep having that 18 months in place. If you, for whatever reason, all those reasons that Lisa talked about, school closures, what I talked about, what Rob talked about, there's tons of political reasons and funding reasons and local governance reasons, all kinds of stuff, why a district might not come in for that fund release. But that's district's cross to bear. And they are bearing it. We are bearing it. So it seems like if you play it out, and we are here, yes, we are here about jobs, but we're here to build schools and do school construction and modernization. It seems to me that we need to play by the rules, stay with the 18 months. In talking to people, CASBO members, they understand that. They understand the great situation change that we have with the economy, and they understand now that November has kicked off that clock again. And in fact, what I just learned this morning from some folks in the audience, and I didn't know this, was that in fact, it's not 18 months, it's from wherever they stopped on the clock, right? Is that right, Juan? So some of these projects may have 6 months or 2 months or 12 months. It's not a full 18 months. So it feels to me like we're moving along. I mean, these projects need time, the districts need time to get going on these projects, get the bids out, do all the things they need to do, and it takes time. In any particular district, I certainly would not ever say to a district, you need to go and front your own money for the uncertainty of ever getting state money, and that's what's held us up. There's no way we're going to put general fund in jeopardy by fronting money for a project which we may never get state funding for. And I think we've been put in that position. So I think it's important to realize, like what Bill said, there's all these forces that are coming at the districts and we're reacting to that. And I just think that districts are doing the best that they can. I really do. We're doing the best that we can, juggling all of these factors. And I would say keep playing by the rules. The rules were set up. The jobs are happening. The bonds are going to go out. And we're doing the best that we can with those jobs. And to start moving unfunded approvals up, I guess I would be concerned, and Rob said this way back at the beginning, if with Gary's proposal, and I really do appreciate the proposal, what I'm trying to wrap my head around is how do you implement it? Because if a district voluntarily, and I would always say it has to be voluntary, not involuntary, voluntarily stepped out, and then 3 months later, hey, we're ready, and there's no money. Now what happens? So now they're back into the place, and I think Rob stated that right at the beginning, was what's to guarantee there's funding when they do step back in? And I think that's a major problem. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Juan, you had something clarified?
With the exception of the CT, they can all come in. I failed to mention that earlier. And the reason why, CTE projects, some of them, they can receive an apportionment, but if they don't have the plans approved by the Division of the State Architect, by CDE, then they get an apportionment, and it's reserved, for lack of a better term, for up to 12 months to go out and get those plans approved. So you may see projects that have received an apportionment on the list, but they may not be able to come in and submit a fund release yet because they don't have their approvals yet. So that is, is one of the things that we started talking about earlier, and that's the way the program's been set up.
Hold on. I'm going to take Sean, then Bill, and then we're going to public comment. So we need to I'll remember that Gary and then Chris after public comment.
I like what Lee said. I agree with most of what she said. But I just want to express some concern that if we allow people to extend the time limit on apportionment, in the medium to long term, it may have a worse effect. It may create fewer jobs. These districts won't have any anything really pushing them anymore to try to get these things out on the street. And so we may be faced with this exact same situation 6 months to a year from now. And I would really just like to see us play by the rules that we've established. We know what they are. Districts, I assume, have adjusted plans to try to work within what's happened with the crisis. And I think we might create a worse situation a little bit further down the line if we start messing with these lists.
Okay. Bill?
Thank you. So a couple of points. DSA implemented a priority point system in their application process. Do we have any feedback about whether that's been effective or not? In other words, that's a line jumping. Oh, sorry. That's a procedure where someone will certify that they're ready to go and they have local funding, don't need state funding. Do we have any data that says this worked or didn't work? I don't know. I'm just, maybe Kathy Hicks is here too, and Richard. But anyway, at some point it'd be interesting. If we're thinking about doing something like this, we've tried one way. Did that do anything? I don't know. I'm just raising the question. Another thing to think about is from a voluntary, we're really asking for districts, probably not just on this list, it's really the unfunded list that's the target, the fruit, if you will, that I think the proposal is going towards. How many districts would voluntarily stand aside? And I mean, and so in my district, I'm a construction professional, and cash flow is king. Would I recommend to my board that we voluntarily step aside? No, I would not. And I don't think that anyone could, if you were serving the interests as a professional in your district and making recommendations regarding giving up a guarantee. I know it's not a guarantee. Pardon me. A sure funding thing for something that's uncertain in the future if everything works out okay after everybody that gets ahead of you goes fine. So I think there's some issues there with understanding how many people would really voluntarily be willing to get out of line. Reimbursement projects, we've touched on it. Our projects are all reimbursement projects. We have local bonds we go through, but the reimbursement issue, the fundamental issue for districts is cash flow. Cash flow is king right now, and if you have local funds and you can keep them going, you use the funds to fund this project, and you rely on the state funds being received at some point to make up the cash flow and fund the next project in line. So reimbursement is a key issue if we're going to consider this in any way. And finally, in this list, I mean, we have Sean sitting here from LA Unified. Why aren't you going on these projects? Has OPSC asked, and you may not get to respond, but has OPSC...
If LAUSD's been called out, they should have a right to respond.
I'm just curious if you, or have we done any research into that?
We're moving forward with our projects. And when the crisis happened, we had to make some decisions, put some things on pause, and some of that has been resolved. And these projects with apportionments, we're moving forward. We kicked off our activities on those projects, and we just need time to get those fund releases in.
Okay, I will now take public comment, and then we will go back, and it'll start with Gary and Chris.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members, Tom Duffy for Cash. Madam Chair, it appears that a new process has been established and that a topic not assigned by the Allocation Board is being discussed by the Implementation Committee.
I will stop you right now. The State Allocation Board did direct the Implementation Committee to have this discussion. So,
they did.
Yes, they did.
Okay. Well, what I was going to suggest, and maybe we can ask the Allocation Board to ask for the discussion at the next meeting, as to whether or not we're at level 3 developer fees because of the state really not making apportionments. Yes, they did at the last meeting, but I think this would be a healthy discussion. If we were at level 3 today, many districts may be able to have enough funds to come in and match the dollars that are the state funds that are apportioned to them. And thank you for the correction, Madam Chair. A lot has been stated here that has been speculated. There have been some comments that I think need to have the light of fact upon them. Last year, we were in a place we'd never been before. The Department of Finance sent out a letter saying no projects funded by state bonds could move forward in terms of contracts. The Office of Public School Construction was unaware that this was going to happen. We told the Allocation Board it was going to happen. We went to Rob Cook and Katrina Valentine and said, you need to come to the board with a number of recommendations to keep the program moving, such as unplugging the clocks on the 18 months and the other clocks relative to CTE and the like, and you know that story. The intent was to keep the program intact, to keep the program moving forward without interruption. That did happen. We continued to talk to Finance, the Treasurer's Office, and the Controller's Office, and the PMIB rather, and indicated that the $2.4 billion in apportionments made up to December 2008 needed to be honored with funding. The pressure was kept on, and you know the history of it. There was a March and an April bond sale and then an October sale. The $2.4 billion was honored by those bond sales. And what happened? OPSD did a marvelous thing beginning in June and through, I think it was January 1, OPSD got out, because the district requested them, 80% of those funds. That is a marvelous thing, a marvelous fact to behold. So some of your comments, Lee, and some of the other comments made by Bill and Rob, I think go to the fact that districts that could did. But we can speculate, and Gary, you can speculate what goes on at the district level by looking at it from about a 50,000-foot level than at the level that people that work in districts today are dealing with all the issues as to why they may not be going forward. But this is not a time to change the program. And I would submit to you that CBIA is not going to be affected if this change occurs. Some of you may be affected. So a stakeholder that wouldn't be affected brings forth and posits a change in a well-established program.
But Tom, I want to stop you there. I think we're all aware of who is talking about this proposal, and I think we're all smart enough and objective to understand those things. But I don't think it needs to be, publicly stated or slammed or used in a way. I think we all know where you may be stating the truth, but this is not stamped a CBIA proposal. They have not put their name on it. It is being brought up and discussed by Gary, but I don't want this body to be open to actively attacking individuals for a worthy discussion, a discussion that needs to happen, a discussion that the State Allocation Board asked us to have. So we're having the discussion. Whether we reach agreement does not matter. We may not reach agreement. I don't foresee us reaching agreement. But what the State Allocation Board asked us to have was have a discussion, highlight the issues, the pros and the cons, because in reality it is them that are going to make the decision. So just like cash cans, CBIA, all the other lobbyists can lobby for what they want. So let's keep it to, let's have a good discussion, and we may disagree on the merits of it. Gary, nope. We may have disagreements on the merits of this, but I do not want this to be a forum that we attack each other.
I appreciate your chastisement. Thank you. The intent of this program has been to allow districts to come in and know that they have a particular date in line when they come into OPSC. They get date stamp. We've been through all that. The 18 months actually came out of the old program. The 18 months came from the old program because there were time limits on apportionments, because one very large school district in California had 100 projects that they didn't move forward on. So back in the late 1980s and through the 1990s, we identified that time limits were important and they were in place, and then they were just moved into the new program. And that was something that the school district wanted, because we thought we needed to be fair about not sitting on money. The 18 months that's in place, and Juan, I think you hit a very important point, and that is, and I was going to approach this in a bit of a different way, but just directly as you had, we're talking about statute that's put in place in order to allow districts to do whatever they need to do at the local level to move projects forward, whether they're having a difficult site acquisition, whether they're having bid protests, whatever it may be. So we do not want to trifle with something that's been tried and true and has worked. So I appreciate your time and listening to me, and it wasn't my intent to attack. It was simply my intent to say this is what happened, because Gary and I had a conversation back in late November, early December about this very thing.
No, absolutely. I know.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Gary may want to respond to me.
But I think
would just like to say just quick.
Briefly. You got 60 seconds or less. Brief.
Our position is, first of all, this is not our proposal. This is, I think, a compilation of other people. But our position is only to create jobs. Our position has nothing to do with impact negatively districts. And whatever comes out of this committee, we're supportive of. But we just believe that we need to create jobs in California. And we boxed ourselves in a corner. And if we can't get out of the corner, we're fine with that.
Gary, you identified this as a problem. I don't think it's a problem. It's a condition.
Okay.
Yeah, may I add one thing?
No.
No, it's about the bonds. It's new information.
I'm breaking all my rules.
Richard Lyon and I met with finance, with Ana Montesantos, and also with Cynthia, and it was on the topic of the bond sales next week and later this month. We requested that school bonds be included, and they were so straightforward with us. We really appreciate it. They basically said, we're looking at everything. We would like to include some school bonds, but they may not be able to be included in the first sale because they won't include any BABs, the Build America bonds. The BABs will be sold in the second sale, and we're hopeful to give schools some of that. And we said, when can we know? And they said, check back with us on Friday. So we're going to check in with them tomorrow.
Actually,
thank you very much. I
I
appreciate your patience and your chastisement. Ooh.
Susan?
Good morning. I'm Susan Stewart, Stewart & Associates, and I've been working with various school districts around the state on the unfunded list. And there is concern out there, and from a lot of school districts, that there's $600 million sitting there, and districts are ready to go on projects, whether it's a reimbursement to free up other projects that are ready for construction, or a project that's actually ready for construction. So we sat down with several school districts, large, small. We sat down with other facilities consultants and set up some parameters. How could we come up with something that isn't nearly as complicated as being discussed right now to try to solve the problem? The first thing we wanted to do is obviously get the money out without changing the system, and there is no variation from the first in, first out. There is not a district out there that I've talked to or a consultant out there that I've talked to that said for the apportionment phase, it's always date order, first in, first out. But the next question is, how do we get the money out? Since it's not date in, no first in, first out, it's really when you're ready. There are, for all the reasons everybody explained up here today, there are numbers of reasons why school districts can't proceed or don't want to proceed with their project right now in these uncertain times. They'd love a delay. These are extraordinary times. This isn't a time when we think, oh, let's just change the rules here, let's just change the rules there. We're not asking for that. We're talking for extraordinary times right now that really do need some unusual solutions. And that's why the stakeholder proposal, this was not, in fact, CBIA's proposal, if you really pinned them down, would want something much more drastic than this. We're just trying to find out something that might work for everybody. We wanted to do something that was based on an action by the State Allocation Board. The State Allocation Board froze apportionments. I mean, they froze timelines, and then they restarted the clocks again. So that's something that the State Allocation Board had already done. We needed something that would be an incentive for districts, if they weren't going to build, to move their project forward for another, or backwards for another time. And so if districts, and we've pulled several districts, they're districts that fall into all the categories. They're districts that would be willing to give up their apportionment until the next bond money is available, whether it's a year or whatever, because they know they're not going to be building before then, in return for having their deadline frozen. There are other districts, we've even had comments from CTE projects that are not going to be ready to go by the time they need to get going, and they would be willing to have an extension of their deadline. So this is, what we're asking is, let's find out. You know, we can all guess what it might be. This might be a $100 million solution out of the $600 million. It may be $50 million. but it's a one-time solution, and possibly we could get some of this money out there on the streets, get some schools built, put people to work, and it's a one-time thing. This wouldn't go on forever. If in 6 months or a year we find ourselves in the same situation, you could sit down and find out what would work that time. This is temporary. It's a voluntary situation. If a district has any idea that they may be going out for bid in the next year, they could easily say, no, thank you. The other thing is when you go down the unfunded list, it has to be date in, date out, because that is an apportionment. Whether it's a reimbursement, whether it's, which could also cause more schools to be built, whether it's an actual apportionment for a school that's ready to go. I have school districts who've told me they have partial schools built, and until they get state funding, they have holes in the ground for their classrooms, and they want to get these classrooms built. So we're just, this stakeholder proposal is not etched in stone. We're just trying to figure out a way to get money out. We're concerned that when Department of Finance looks at the big picture and looks at the $600 million sitting there that has not been touched, that may be a factor in them apportioning or allocating money from the state bond sales to school districts. So anyway, we're just hoping to come up with some solution. This, not trying to change the program. If we can do this without any major reg changes, this is a one-time thing because we're in a big mess, and districts really need to get their projects built. When you go down the line on the unfunded list, districts would have the opportunity to say, I'm ready, I'm not ready. They'd keep their place in line. Nobody gets bumped out of line. There's no line jumping. It's just projects that need an extension and do not want to build today can exchange an extension in their deadline for forgoing the money until the state sells bonds and gets it out there. Anyway.
Any other public comment? Gary, you're first after.
Good morning. My name is Lisa LeBlanc, and I'm the Executive Director of Facilities and Planning for Fresno Unified School District. And Fresno Unified does support doing whatever we can and whatever methodology can be used to get funding for the shovel-ready projects without harming other districts. Just an example of where we're at, we have several projects on the unfunded list at this time. Every one of those projects are either completed with their construction or are under construction at this point. So we are one of the lucky districts that have been able to go forward. We have the local money to do that. However, going back to the reimbursement issue, we do need to get that reimbursement back so we can move forward, create new jobs, address our needs at our schools with that money. So we do support and anything that could be considered to look at the unfunded approvals and to fund those shovel-ready projects. Thank you.
Any other public comment?
Good morning. Wael El-Attar from San Bernardino State Unified School District. I think the main issue that we are talking about is actually the unfunded list, not necessarily the 18 months window of time. Because if you look at the 18 months schedule attachment A, you'll find out that it's actually working very well for the first 6 months or so from now till July or August. There are not so many projects that will be expiring for the 18 months window of time. We are a school district that is impacted. We have school projects in the apportionment list. We also have a project on the unfunded list. We have a schedule to move forward with all the projects on the apportionment list, and in fact, we're actually submitting for fund release for a few already, and we are submitting this month. We're moving forward about 3 to 4 projects as we move forward, and we plan to complete all these projects or put them in construction by July or August of this year. Our concern about moving forward with something different than first in, first out is what's going to be the impact on the projects on the unfunded list or the workload. And as you are aware that from the new construction, there is very little amount left in new construction. So if some projects are moved from the apportionment list to the unfunded list, where is it going to be in the unfunded list? We believe that these projects should go, if the direction to go that route, and we are not supporting that, should go at the bottom of the work list. Thank you.
Thank you. Public.
Last one, I'll be short, but just to tell you how it really does work in a school district, another example, Ted Rossi, Assistant Superintendent, Corona Norco Unified School District. Currently on the apportionment list, we have the second largest project, the $16 million that's identified there. That is for an intermediate school, which we've completed all the site improvements. We'll issue 3 contracts in 2 weeks and the rest of the contracts in about 2 months. So we're obviously we're well underway on that project. On the unfunded list, on the unfunded list, we have 3 projects, 2 of which are under construction, both of which are in excess of $30 million, which we've fronted. Another one that's about to be under construction. When those reimbursements can be received, then we'll start with the second phase of a Centennial High School project, the construction of a new elementary school. And all this is in the backdrop, as Ms. Kaplan said, about the district. We will issue 500 notices tomorrow, RIF notices, to try and create or to try and fill a $31+ million hole. But in the backdrop of that, we're up 800 students from last year, so we have all kinds of moving parts going on. Interesting district. We've done a lot with our own local funds, and obviously we have projects that are under construction and other projects that are ready to start construction. So we support whatever mechanism we can to move money along, but we don't want to harm those projects that have already been approved.
Thank you. Any other public comment? Questions from the board? We start with Gary, then Chris, and then Sean.
Yeah.
Sean, you're good? Okay.
The only comments I have are, first of all, we certainly have no intent to affect districts anyway, and if the program stays as is fine. Our perspective is that we're sitting on $3 billion in approved projects. $3 billion, either on the portioned or unfunded list. Last month, you moved out with $20 million worth of school construction. That's it. And I think it's incumbent on everybody in this room that we want to create jobs. We want to create jobs for architects. We want to create jobs for the labor. We want to create jobs for everyone out in the community. And we have a viable program here. We have viable projects, and it's not moving. They are not moving. So when Lee said jobs are being created, jobs are not being created. We have $3 billion of demand sitting there, matched with another $3 billion locally. You're talking about $6 billion that somehow we need to get out. And I will submit to you that in 2 or 3 months, if nothing happens, which probably won't, which is fine, we're going to be in the same situation. The amount of money being apportioned for projects, shovel-ready projects, are going to go out $20 to $30 to $40 million a month. And if that continues over time, then I don't know where the program will be long-term. So I think, maybe we take a look at it. We see, hopefully, they'll have large bond sales, and hopefully we'll start moving 2 or 3, 400 million out a month, which is what we did historically over time, and that would be great. But if not, I would really recommend that we relook at this. In the interim, I think what Susan brought up, which is, I think it should be more dramatic, but what she brought up is some kind of volunteer program of at least allowing those people in the portion projects to voluntarily move off. And that could free up $100, $200 million, which we could then fund, in order, in date order there on unfunded lists. At least try something. At a minimum, it'll measure how many projects are out there that maybe aren't really shovel-ready in the next short term. So with that, that's the general overview. I will not get into the level 3 issue.
Chris, then Bill.
Sure. I just have a couple quick questions for a couple of the public commenters. Number one, Susan, if you could speak to potentially why the CTE projects are being delayed and if there is anything that we could do to encourage those projects being completed. And then second, I noticed that there's $75 million on the list for San Bernardino City Unified in terms of projects. If you could speak to what is causing those delays, that might be helpful information.
On the CTE project, that was given to me by another consultant who is not here right now, and I'd be happy to provide that information to the committee when he either arrives or when I can talk to him.
Yeah.
It's basically getting out of DSA. It's just that they did a portion, but they...
Okay, why don't you mention?
Lynn Scott with Richard Gonzalez and Associates. The project that Susan's talking about is one that's been apportioned for CTE, but they won't be out of DSA in time to meet the deadline for applying. And so they would be willing to step aside until they get their approved plans if they can retain first in line on the next issuance of bond money.
So is that they can't clear DSA, or DSA doesn't have the ability to review that project in the time frame?
It's probably a combination of both, that by the time they can get in, that the DSA won't be able to get it out in time as this is going through.
One question. Did this project seek an extension to the 12 months?
You know, Juan, I don't know the answer to that because I just was told about this morning. I would have to think that...
Because there were some regulations that we adopted to allow districts to request a one-year extension for those CTE projects. I'll be curious to know if this is one of them that requested one or not.
And I don't know the answer to that.
Well?
Well, if you look at the attachment that shows the project that had been funded since November, you will see that San Bernardino has projects in there. In fact, there are 3 projects that had been funded since November and that not included in that list, so for a total of $75 million. What's really happening here is that since turning on the clock in November, it takes time to remobilize and move forward with all these projects. So we have a schedule that we are bidding 4 projects on average 4 to 5 weeks. And therefore we go to for fund release in that period of time. It takes the district...
Well, can you actually describe, because you had a discussion with me, what it takes, because I know some districts can get out and come in within 6 to 8 weeks. What is it with your timeline?
Sure. First, let me share with you that these are all modernization projects. They are all hardship projects. So we really had to wait till the turn on the clock to start again. So it takes about 60 days for completing constructability reviews again, and also putting the bid specs out in the street. And it takes about 30 days to complete the bid process, which is advertisement, 2 weeks, and and all of that. And then for the district, it takes about 3 weeks to put an item. Once the bid's open, it takes 3 weeks, and I think most districts are the same. It takes about 3 weeks to put a board item in the agenda. But before that, we also start to receive a great number of protests due to the fact that there are a great competition out there. Right now, every bid we have, we receive about 20 bids. So usually there is a protest somewhere included there. So it takes about 2 more weeks to go through that and work that out. And then another week after the board approves. So it's about 4 to 6 months period of time for us from the time that the clock is turned on for us to come to the state allocation board or the OBSC for fund release.
Do those on the implementation committee think that it might be helpful to potentially ask school districts what their timeline and process is? I mean, would Department of Finance find that information helpful so that we could see variations of what Whale does and maybe what other districts in the timeline, so that maybe then we can have a discussion in reality of what are we looking at, and then can look at the timelines?
Sure, that would be helpful. I know I've heard districts state that they could get it in 3 months. Some districts now are showing 4 to 6. So, yeah, the variation is definitely, the information is definitely helpful.
Yeah, what I would like to mention again is that we have a schedule, and we plan to complete or submit fund release for all these projects by August of this year. Thank you.
Bill?
I just wanted to wrap up with a couple of thoughts, and want to thank Gary for his restraint, not rising to the bait on the, anyway. I think, notwithstanding, Susan kind of framed this as a very simple thing. I think, based on the discussion we're having here today, it's a simple idea with a really complex set of implementation pieces to it. And if we did it, because obviously one of the things we focused on that's come up and it affects our district and others, the reimbursement question, because that's beyond shovel-ready, right? But that's just one level at which we have complexity here. So it may be that if we were to proceed with something, it has actually a fairly complex set of regulatory things that we'd have to put together to make this work. It's not as simple as I think we make it sound. Focusing on, we need to focus on the glass being half full, not half empty, which is over 80% of the bond funds that we have received in this period have fund releases and are going, and the projects are out there. So that's a pretty decent record. We don't know how that compares with our other infrastructure partners, with Caltrans or whatever out there, and that would be interesting information. And I don't think we want to make school districts look like we're doing a worse job of getting the money out on the street. And I don't think anybody has the data, frankly, or maybe you guys do. So that would be an interesting thing. 50% of the projects on this list are CTE, okay? 33 and 16, right? 49% are CTE. This is a program that is a popular program with the legislature.
Which list?
On the attachment C. And if you look at attachment D, graph D, 50% of the projects are CTE.
Of dollars. Two-thirds of the projects are CTE.
Okay. So this is a program that has a unique set of timelines. It's a program that is a extremely popular program with the governor, with the legislature, with Republicans, with Democrats. It's about creating, an infrastructure for jobs, and I just question whether we want to mess around with it. And it has this built-in lag with it that's related to CDE and DSA approval, and it was set up like that. So, I just question whether we want to do anything related to that. But, and not to contradict my lobbyist, Mr. Duffy, but it may be that we do want to consider program changes in a time of crisis, and I think what we should be doing is trying to create and looking at every opportunity that we have. What can we do better? How can we be more nimble? And how can we take the lessons that we've learned here in this as we're here and go forward? So I don't think that we would have a problem with using this as a point of discussion to say, what are some of the things that we could do better? How could we set this up? Are the timelines right? Do we have mechanisms in place that we can respond? Because this crisis is maybe going to be found in a reverse way in the coming months or years. And so I would be okay, and I know Cash would, to participate in a discussion about what can we do to respond to this situation. But I think it's a longer-term discussion than just taking a simple proposal, and we'd be happy to participate in that discussion. And finally, there are some other ways that we could look at some of the programs that we have in the state program that aren't getting money on the street quickly enough. Could we do things with those? So, for example, the High Performance Schools Incentive Grant Program, $100 million set aside, 85 or 86 million or so is still sitting there. And we've talked about it at the allocation board meeting this last time, and I know there's a working group going on about that. But are there ways that you create or you incentivize districts to go after that money and create conditions where that money can get out on the street?
That's a great conversation we can have next month.
Yes, indeed. Anyway, thank you for the opportunity.
And Bill, I actually want to thank you. You hit a lot of points that I wanted to summarize on this conversation. Here's what I saw this conversation was. One, it was a very valid and good conversation. I think it was a conversation that needed to be had, highlight a bunch of issues that we need to look at. My philosophy, and I take this as a school board member, just because we've done things a certain way doesn't mean there isn't a better way to do it. And I think it's always valid to look at what we've done, how can we do it better, what things can we look at it changing. I know change hurts and people don't like change, but education's never going to look the same. School construction isn't going to look the same. So how are we working within this industry that we can make things better? One, DSA has made a commitment, and Stephen Amos over at DGS has said we're going to reduce bend time. I'm going to streamline the process. You know, you've talked about delays. Well, we're going to make sure that we're customer friendly, and we can find ways that we can streamline projects, get them in and get them out, so that we no longer have the delays that school districts have become accustomed to. I know for a fact OPSC is looking to do more with less. How do we streamline what happens at OPSC? How do we take the plan review time? How do we do things within these time constraints and budget cuts? How do we do things better? So I think everybody's having that conversation. We've got less, trying to do more, and how do we streamline with accountability and transparency at the same time? So these are all valid conversations going on, which bring up the, if you have suggestions of things that we can have discussions and conversations about, these are valid times to look into that, of what can we do differently, what can we do better. Something I think that is absolutely valid that we need to look into. We see that 49% of the dollars are CTE. That is what is holding us up. We know that the process isn't the 1, 2, 3 of CDE, DSA, OPSC. It's the 1, 3, 2, and that adds on extra time. So it may be a valid discussion of to take a step back. We all support CTE projects. They are very popular. But how do we allow it such that we can get districts to actually move forward on them? Does the CTE project work as written? Do we need to go back to the table? In the discussion of the next bond, how can we make this program work better? These are bigger issues that we actually need to have a conversation about right now, because there is a potential bond that may be coming out. So this discussion is valid in highlighting areas that we can do things better, that I think we need to continue on having that discussion. I think it may be valid to take a step back and ask ourselves, is the 18-month timeline, is that valid? Is it objective? Is it appropriate? What works with districts, or did districts just work with it because we have an 18-month timeline, and so they make things work within an 18-month timeline? I think those are the questions that need to be asked, because the 18-month works for districts because they're going to take the whole 18 months right now. But in time of boom, districts didn't take the whole 18 months. So where is that line, understanding that the economy is going to go up and down? It's, you know, it's fluid at every 10, 15-year process that we're going to see this change. But I think these are questions we need to ask ourselves. I think it's a question that, you know, sorry, Gary, that if we've got an unfunded list and we're not selling, where does developer fee trigger? Is this what we intended with level 3 developer fees? You know, what is that point that if we're saying we have an unfunded list, and what are the regs and the statutes, and, you know, how are they written? Because if we're claiming that there's an unfunded list and there's nothing, well, then when does level 3 trigger? But if we really don't have an unfunded list because it's the state, you know, then level 3 doesn't trigger. And how are we viewing things objectively within statute and regulations to make sure that there's consistency? And I think it would be a great idea to educate us at OPSC and use the information that, Whale, you gave us to ask districts to also help us educate Department of Finance to further understand the process. And I think we can probably look into of when we, and use our April bond sale as an example. When we did that, how long did it take districts to come in? You know, what was their shovel-ready, quote-unquote, timeline from the time they got a portion to the time that they came in? And is this what we see as consistency, so that there is an understanding, a greater understanding of what it actually takes to get people on the ground and people into jobs, of knowing that when the sale happens, it is maybe a 6-month process before you really see the impact of that sale, and you see the money going through, which then helps stimulate the economy, and we find more people into jobs, because I think we're all here for the same purpose of how do we stimulate the economy and benefit our kids and do it in an appropriate manner. But I thank everybody for this conversation. I think it was a really valid conversation. If I missed anything in that summarization, any takers? Did I miss? Well, thank you. So let's take, it is now approximately almost 10:45. So let's take about a let's take a 20-minute break. So we'll come back at 11:05 to discuss seismic safety. Thank you. We're going to get started. We're going to now have the discussion on seismic. So who at DSA? Oh, hello. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
As we give everybody as they're filing in. So to briefly frame the issue, what you'll find on page 17 as we discuss the seismic program, in August 2009, at the SAB meeting, the SAB approved a motion that basically requesting DSA to, one, develop new criteria for any school building that has been declared as part of an engineering study to be an imminent threat of collapse during a seismic event, and two, consider the limited amount of funding available because there will be no seismic unfunded list for projects beyond the $199.5 million in bonding authority. So it has you develop that criteria to keep that in mind. And so with that, DSA is now back upon us to give that report based on what was directed by the State Allocation Board. So welcome. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. I am Kathy Hicks, Acting Deputy Director for the Division of the State Architect, and we have a very short presentation. The definition of most vulnerable that we did that set up the initial criteria had a scientific basis. We've researched extensively, cannot find any such scientific basis for which we could define imminent threat of collapse, and any definition that we adopted would cause the funding authorized by statute for the seismic mitigation program to be potentially exceeded. So we don't have any change proposed for the criteria.
What might be a little helpful is if by chance you could go over your proposal, since most of the implementation committee members may have not received it until right before this meeting.
What I just went over is essentially all that it says. It just summarizes that the State Allocation Board requested DSA define imminent threat of collapse so that we could be used in eligibility criteria that you just summarized, basically. The only thing that I didn't specify was that DSA developed the seismic mitigation program criteria defining the most vulnerable school facilities using information developed for the Hazard United States multi-hazard methodology. And this methodology was the whole basis for establishing the very first criteria, the shaking intensity and the ranking of the Category 2 building types, so that we could establish the initial criteria that was used. There is no known scientific basis to define imminent threat of collapse.
Thanks. Yes, Bill?
I think I'm a little disappointed in this, frankly. And I think what we were, the part of the genesis of this discussion at the Allocation Board and that we've been having in considering this program, and just so you can have some background, we have 17 school sites on the AB 300 list. The northern branch of the Hayward Fault directly bisects our district. We have 7 sites that are within 2,000 feet of the Hayward Fault, subject to severe ground shaking, et cetera. So it's a real interest to us. I think that the point of the discussion about imminent potential collapse was to focus on for example, the way the regulations are written, the structural types that are identified as being the only structural types that are allowed for inclusion in the program or analysis in the program are limited to certain types that are pretty close. So if you start at unreinforced masonry, that's a no-brainer, right? And then you get further and further along all the way to the most modern steel brace frame building. But what DSA did, and if you'll recall, in the first round of regulations, there were only, 4 building types that were included? Isn't that correct? And then they did move that eventually, and in the first round, after nobody came forward to participate in the program, DSA moved in and added 4 more building types.
Yes, we added 4 more building types because we contacted all the buildings that we thought that were on the very first list and determined some of them to no longer be in use or to have been replaced or already have had the seismic upgrade done. So then that gave us some flexibility within the statutory authorized expenditure to add more building types so that we've stayed within that funding parameter.
I can appreciate that we're arriving at decisions about seismic safety and safety of our students based on the amount of money we have available. However, I don't think it's appropriate. But anyway, I think that what we're trying to get at when we talk about defining imminent threat of collapse or potential for collapse was that it's not. If you take a structural engineering evaluation, because the whole piece of this and the way that you're talking about it here is as if DSA would be defining that, and that's not really how it happens in the program. How it happens is that a district retains a structural engineering consultant to evaluate the buildings, and using the ASCE E31 criteria, right? And you use that criteria. That criteria very specifically has a methodology that you use, including computer-generated mapping of all of the connections and every single piece of the building, all of the forces. They check the overstressing of the forces. That methodology has a way that you arrive at, is there an imminent potential for collapse, or is there a collapse potential in the building? And I think what we were asking for when we went to the SAB and asked them to do this was looking beyond limitations related to structural type or location, because and doing an analysis by your structural engineer that says if you end up, independent of what kind of building it is, that you have a potential for collapse, why would that not be a vulnerable school building? And so
there's no doubt that they probably are some vulnerable school buildings, and that a structural engineering analysis could be done on many buildings, and you could get somebody to submit to us a report that says that it's in an imminent danger of collapse. But the fact of the matter is that essentially would create an unfunded list, because we have identified X number of buildings that already are identified as most vulnerable and pose an imminent threat. So there is an unspoken liability, a commitment to those buildings already been made by virtue of identifying them. And when you open it up to more, the parameters that were set out to us was that you don't create an unfunded obligation and that you don't expose the state to greater liability.
Well, and of course, I guess, just not to continue the dialogue, but let me just make one more point. All that does is transfer all the liability to the school district. Thank you very much.
Chris? I would note that the State Allocation Board made it very clear they did not want to exceed the $199.5 million available, so any discussion that would exceed that exceeds what the board has requested. The board requested a discussion for an alternative process, but they wanted to ensure that it did not exceed the 199.5. What the state architect has identified is that the 199.5 is spoken for based on the 77 buildings that were identified.
Let's just follow that logic for a second, because what I'm hearing in the report is that districts, in fact, are not speaking for this money. The state's identified buildings, knows that they're out there, and yet districts are not speaking for the money.
Districts haven't requested the funding yet, but there are a number of reasons that they haven't come in for their projects, just like the previous discussion. There's a number of reasons why a district hasn't requested their fund release. Yes. Those are local priorities.
There's many parallels to this discussion and that which you just had earlier. So, we can go down the path of if school districts wanted to waive those 25 buildings or whatever are currently on the list, if they want to waive their right to this funding, and then we could potentially open it up to others, similar to the discussion we were having earlier.
Obviously, that's a whole other discussion, but don't want to reprise that one. I guess, so basically what I'm seeing from this report is nothing's wrong, we're not going to fix it, and the net result of that is this money will never go out for seismic renovation. And I think it's a sad statement on our commitment as a state to the seismic safety of our students when this money will never be spent, is what you're saying.
That's not what I'm saying.
That's how I'm reading between the lines.
It's different than what I'm saying.
Fred, and then Juan.
Juan, can you clarify the distinction between a seismic and a other facility hardship?
Facility hardship program, before the seismic mitigation piece or component was added on, and this is still true for facility hardship projects, you have to demonstrate an imminent threat of a health and safety. Difference between that and seismic mitigation is that there's a potential of collapse in the event of a seismic activity. So currently in the facility hardship program, there's a problem, there's an immediate problem now, there's analysis that has been done by engineers that says that the kids can't be there right now. Seismic, there'll be a problem if there is a seismic activity. That's a basic description of the difference between the two.
Brent?
But there have been facility hardships for floods, which is a condition of something else. Most of them do seem to be, well, not most, but many do seem to be conditional. It's located at a dangerous intersection, conditional upon a truck leaving the intersection. The flood one perhaps is a more parallel discussion to seismic activity in California. So I don't know if that's...
Chris?
To speak to what Fred's saying, historically these projects would have come in under modernization. So effectively when you're speaking to facility hardship, you're speaking to modernization on these. So these projects do have an alternative to come in under, subject to they meet the modernization criteria, which in general they do because they haven't been retrofitted in the past 25 years.
Right, which raises a whole, is the modernization program now a seismic retrofit program, or is it an educational modernization program? So, or is it an ADA program, or whatever it is?
Yeah, Bill?
I just wanted to follow up that, say that the board did approve changes to the regulations in August of 2009. Just going back to your comment, Bill, that, there aren't as many projects as we would like participating in the program, but the regulations were changed in an effort to open it up. Along with those changed regulations, there was a different motion that the board made to, have DSA take a look at this part. So there is an effort. The board did make an effort to open up the regulations, and along with that was this part of that approval. So that's why we're here to take a look at this part. But there have been changes to the regulations to hopefully allow other buildings to qualify and not exceed the 199.5, of course.
Thank you. And I appreciate that, since the change in regulations allowed our district to have one of our most vulnerable schools go forward, and we're in the process right now. I think the discussion, we can't let this go. The paragraph that starts at the end of your attachment page regarding the potential for time-based performance assessments to determine probability of casualties, financial loss and damage, or downtime over a given period of time is actually an interesting proposal, and it may be one way to try and get some momentum, keep some momentum here, so that we can figure out how we do get more projects identified that are possible to go forward within the constraints of the funding. Okay, I'm giving you that one.
Being optimistic about how you're reading that, because what we would do is start with those that already fit the eligibility criteria and rank them in order of most severe to the least severe, and then we're in a position where we're further committed on the liability because now we've ranked them, and I'm not sure that this gets to where you think it's going either.
Well, and that may be true, but to me, if you look at the last sentence, you say the cost to develop the methodology for applications estimated approximately 50 for blah, 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 200,000 is what you add those two together, right? Mm-hmm. Why is this not a good use of resources, and why couldn't the bond funds be, the funds that are set aside for seismic safety be used for that? If this is a part of the program of getting the money out there and making and designing an appropriate program that meets seismic safety needs. So I would, as one member of the committee, support going forward with this kind of a study to help us identify and rank and prioritize.
I'm willing to do that. More than happy to, if you can make us some funding available to proceed. I just want to caution you that whoever that school district is that ends up being the first most vulnerable of the most vulnerable school districts might not be too thrilled with where you're headed.
Well,
so.
And maybe
who's ranked number one?
Yeah, and it could be maybe looking at this in a different way, because the AB 300 report, identified billions of dollars of issues, and looking at this, and we only have just a small amount of funding currently here, so it's a bigger issue that is probably politically being discussed, with our leaders at the legislature and with the governor's office in developing, a next bond, and will there be money for a seismic mitigation program. But I think it may be valid to maybe take a step back and not have it specifically apply to the projects that DSA has defined, but what would be the time-based performance assessments? What are the criteria that DSA would use to put it into place, not apply it to those projects? Because I kind of have a hunch that this is not the end of the program. So if this is not the end of the program, would developing these criteria be valid for future usage if the program was to stay around? I think that's the question that we need to ask, of whether having DSA finding the money and have DSA move forward on this, is this something that is valid for future?
And that would be something that would be great for future bond discussions, but that's not what we were tasked with by the board here today.
But that could be something in the report of summarization of, issues that were brought up and not answered. But even with what we were not tasked with the board today, it was develop new criteria. DSA has indicated that there's not the ability to develop new criteria, but DSA also said that it is feasible to develop time-based performance assessments that can be used to determine the probability of this. I think it's then incumbent upon presenting that to the board and having the board give direction if that's something that they wish.
I think that's being misconstrued. What the state architect is saying here is that within the $199.5 million, they've identified 77 projects that would consume the entirety of the funding. So they've done what the board asked. They've looked. They've said within the board's request that we stay within the 199.5 and consider an alternative process. We cannot do that because the entirety of the funding would be consumed already as is. So the alternative process wouldn't qualify additional districts under their basic criteria that it has to stay within the funding.
Well, and I don't...
Which I believe that's for the board to decide. This is...
Which they did.
True, but information has been brought up, and just like I always said, based on learning and education, new information becomes available. It's an incumbent upon us to present it to the board so that the board makes decisions based on all information that they have.
So, point of
and it can be done in a report.
Just point of clarification based on what you think, your statement that you thought it could possibly be applied to other buildings. It is possible that we would look at other buildings that met the 1.68 G, the lateral force and the building types, but most likely those are the ones that we've already deemed to be the most vulnerable, so it would be expansion, or to the extent we became aware that there were more buildings that fit in those parameters that exceed the AB 300 report, it's possible. Most likely you're going to get right back to where we are right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, can I comment on that? Well, if you look at the top sentence, the end of the sentence that starts on the top of the second page or the back of the page, you say in parentheses, say all school facilities in areas with ground shaking potential in excess of 1.5 Gs. So, I mean, you're kind of leaving the door open here. So I'm not quite sure why you're saying, only within the existing 1.68 criteria, because you're saying the advantage to the approach is that it could be applied to a group of buildings that's actually outside the original criteria, is what you're saying. I'm just...
Okay, well, my cost estimate for the $200,000 was for the 200 million...
$200,000 for the study.
$200,000 for the study was for the number of buildings that were already identified. If you start taking it down to lower shaking intensities, then you're talking about more buildings and more, we have to know exactly where all the buildings are and look at the types and categories, and then it gets to be more expensive. You don't get all of that for $200,000.
Okay, I can appreciate that. One of the things that, and I know we can, as long as we've got a few more minutes here before we stop, one of the things that's not really covered by the way the regulations are written, and I think was part of where we were trying to get with looking more broadly at things and never want to go outside the 200 million. But there are many, many school sites in the state of California that are, for example, not necessarily within, directly adjacent to the fault, but sit on bay mud, bay fill, and are subject to high liquefaction potential and other geohazards that create the risk of collapse from a seismic event. And Los Angeles is filled with those, Long Beach, the Bay Area is filled with schools like that. So this is a whole area that we haven't even touched, because the way the regulations are written right now, there's absolutely no opportunity for a school district that has a a site that's identified as a liquefaction hazard to participate in the seismic mitigation program. And I think that's what we're looking at, is how can we open up the program, or how can we understand the full range of seismic hazards that we have. And that would be just something that I think we're trying to find. Could I ask you a question about what DSA is doing in the status of your outreach?
Outreach on?
The status of the AB 300 list update. Isn't that part of what the board has asked you guys to do also?
Do you know what the status is on that? I'm not up to speed.
Well, there's calls going. I mean, your people are doing it.
We're doing outreach. Yes, it is going ongoing. Although they keep telling me it's at about 80%. It's about 80%. So it is happening. But we're also actually focusing our outreach to the school districts that are on this list, just to see what they've done with other projects in their district and their how many projects they have moving forward to OPSC and some other issues too. Since the biggest hurdle that they've identified for us is local funding, so that they're not able to move forward. So we wanted to have a better awareness of what's happening in those districts.
Great.
It is my pleasure at this time to introduce Senator Lonnie Hancock, who is actually one of my bosses and the State Allocation Board member.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and I'm glad to be here with the members of the Implementation Committee. I just found out, coming off the floor from session, that at 5:56 last night, my office was informed by the Division of the State Architect that they had been asked in August to come up with a definition of seismic safety, particularly imminent threat of collapse, which is undefined at this point, so that we could make decisions about funding from the earthquake retrofit program for the State Allocation Board. We have been told that they can't do that unless they get more money. I just have to say that I am extremely concerned. This came to the board's attention because of a school in my district that had been classified by engineers in the district as being an imminent threat of collapse. And I think that we have an obligation to ensure that students and staff, everyone who goes into our public schools, is safe. And I'm concerned about bin time, as many of us are, as we look how long things sit in agencies without decisions being made. And I don't know if the committee wants to explore ways to get the $200,000 that would be necessary to have the state architect come up with a methodology to identify school buildings that are vulnerable, or if there is something we could do to speed this up and use some common definition as is used by seismic engineers. But I do want to call this to the board's attention, and I think we need to expedite these things. That it's while we have bond money out there that can be used, it's inexcusable to have things sit at the state month after month after month and not make decisions. So simply to urge you, please, to see if you can come up with a way to move us forward on these issues.
Senator Hancock, is what am I hearing from you? I just want to clarify. Are you asking for a report to be given to the State Allocation Board meeting in March on this presentation to provide further options and feedbacks for the State Allocation Board to direct whether they want to spend the $200,000 or not?
Yes, I would like that. Thank you. And if not, what we are going to do to get a definition ASAP so that we can begin to fund earthquake retrofit projects. I mean, if somebody dies in an earthquake because we couldn't agree on a definition of imminent threat of collapse, we are all going to regret it immeasurably. And we do have districts ready to go. They're very concerned about their seismic safety. And I'm sorry, but we know enough about this kind of engineering, so this ought to be doable.
Senator Hancock, I will also talk to the chair of the State Allocation Board meeting and see how we can get something of a report, and I will work with OPSC to see if we can get something to the March board meeting as we're developing the agenda.
Thank you very much. I would appreciate it.
Bill?
Comment. Thank you, Senator Hancock, for coming here and reinforcing the discussion that we're having. And we really appreciate your support of this. And we were heading towards, I think, having our committee ask the DSA kind of refine their proposal for developing a methodology, and then we would, I hope, ask the allocation board to set aside what the costs that they need to fund the study at 1% of the total amount of the overall bond. It seems like it's an appropriate way for us to help to focus the program and work towards a seismic safety program that actually works.
That may be a very, very good plan. I would simply say it needs to be done fast. Well and fast. Because we've been watching what's going on in Chile and other places, and we are on earthquake faults that could go at any time, and not to move forward because we don't have a definition. I get a little worried about a methodology to get a definition. Please, could we find a way to get to the definition with all deliberate speed? Would be my request.
Kathy?
To the committee.
Senator, I need to clarify that DSA is not able to find a scientific basis to support the definition of imminent threat of collapse. You can, we've basically determined that you can get an engineer to come up with to do an evaluation, structural evaluation of your building, and they will, in fact, give you a recommendation that it is an imminent threat of collapse, but it doesn't mean that it would then be eligible for the criteria of the seismic mitigation program. It would probably, if once you got that evaluation, you'd need to proceed as a facility hardship, not as the seismic mitigation program. The state has already defined those buildings that fit the criteria or already established the criteria that maxes out the $199.5 million that was authorized by statute for the program, and we're not able to change that criteria without having other buildings go in and leaving some on a list and creating an unfunded list.
Thank you. It did take 7 months to get that.
So, I'm sorry, Senator, I just started working at the Division of the State Architect in January 27th, so I apologize for the delay, and it won't happen again.
Fine, as long as we can move forward and make our children safe. That is the goal.
Also, I'd like to take the opportunity to tell you that our bin time is reduced from 12 weeks to 4.2 weeks now on a statewide average, and we are actively imposing performance metrics and measuring and doing workload balancing across the state to make sure that we get our plan review approvals completed much more timely.
I think that's very good. And a month of bin time, I hope that we could get it down even more, but I think I'm glad that you're improving, and we will certainly be watching. What can I say? It's time to be entrepreneurial here. Get that money out the door.
Thank you, Senator. Juan, did you have?
I'm sure you know this, Senator, but the challenge that we've had is, we have a finite amount of money, dollar figure, and I know that we would love to have more, but we only have so much. So the challenge has been to develop criteria that would focus on the most vulnerable, and statute reads, Category 2 buildings. So that's where the challenge started from the beginning of this program, is how do you identify those so that you do target at the most vulnerable Category 2. As you know, the board did adopt some regulations in August to open up the criteria because we didn't have a whole lot of buildings that came forward to qualify. And the latest, I think, assignment that DSA had was to also take a look at other definitions of imminent threat of collapse So it's a challenging issue to get to when you run the risk of going above and beyond what's available. And I think that, Ms. Hicks can testify that that's what they looked at, and they didn't, or they couldn't come up with a scientific basis to come up with that definition. So,
and something that has been brought up and has been left open that kind of follows along our previous conversation, of those 77 projects, which ones have the likelihood of moving forward on that? And if there are those that are not going to move forward, what is the process for then reassessing it?
And just for point of clarification, the methodology that we were proposing to take on would be to rank all of the potential seismic hazard buildings or buildings that have potential seismic risk, so that we get to the point where we know for future bond discussions where they are. For now, the $200,000 would only cover those that have already been deemed to fit the eligibility criteria for the existing seismic mitigation program. Once we get that methodology, applying it more and more is very feasible, though, to lower and lower levels of criteria thresholds.
Yeah, thank you. I was just a little surprised when I was handed this memo that I said arrived in my office about 6 o'clock last night for the meeting today, that the statement is also made that DSA is not the appropriate entity to define imminent threat of collapse. I would have hoped that if that were the case, if there's some other agency that is, or some other methodology, we would have started on it sooner and would be moving it more quickly. Having said that, I know that this is a time when we do want to make sure that our money is out on the street, in the communities, making our schools safer and better, putting the people of California to work. So my interest, and I think an interest of the people on the board, many of the people on the board, is that we treat this like the very serious and critical issue that it is, and that we get on with it, that we get a definition. I get very nervous now hearing about we're going to rank every building according to the new methodology once we've done studies and have a methodology. We need to have this money move out into the community to help our schools. And again, in this time, we're looking in every department and everywhere of what is the value added of our agencies and our bureaucracy here in the state, and how do we operate so that communities are going to get the benefit of every dollar as quickly as they possibly can. So I think I've made my point. I did want to come up because, as I said, we got off the floor and the meeting was going on. So I wanted to just let you know that I think there is a sense of urgency, and I hope that we can move very quickly to get it resolved. And if it is going to take doing a study, taking some of the bond money, whatever it takes, I'll be looking forward to the recommendation of the implementation committee at our March meeting.
Senator Hancock, thank you so much for taking time out of your already busy schedule to provide valuable insight and views on this discussion.
Well, thank you all very, very much.
Bill? Yep.
If you go back to the second paragraph where you begin your memo, you say that when you did outreach to districts about lack of participation in the program, the primary reason is due to insufficient local matching funds and not a function of the eligibility criteria. And I don't know if that's totally the case or not, but if it is, and we have identified, you're telling me you got 77 buildings, right, or whatever it is, whatever the number is, that somehow are known already in terms of their ground shaking, Category 2, serious vulnerabilities. If there's an inability to act on the part of districts that's based on a lack of local funds, why couldn't this program be changed, or couldn't we essentially fund the entire project? In other words, Are we going to sit here and say, well, there's not sufficient local funds for the number 2 ranked collapse potential building in the state, but since they don't have local funds, that's too bad. We're going to walk away.
I think that would require legislative changes, Bill.
Well, okay. We need to figure out where to go. So in other words, that would be essentially making it into a hardship program, right?
Yeah. Is there any kind of a hardship provision for this?
For 100% financing for these types, no.
But the rest could be under a facility hardship, perhaps.
How does this work under the facility hardship program?
It's a part of it.
Seismic is under the facility hardship program. The provisions for the seismic mitigation program are under a facility hardship. So they're really, in essence, a component of facility hardship.
The downside of where you're headed, though, is once you declare it an imminent threat of health and safety, then don't you have to get out of the building and stop using it in the interim? Yes. So then you are now without that facility, and now you're going to go wait in line for an unfunded apportionment.
Well, and just to share with you, that's exactly what our district is doing. We have our engineering study for our identified building, and it said potential for collapse, and the board took action, and we're building the temporary campus right now at our own expense, $3.5 million for 3 years, and then we're getting in line for our funding. But I mean, frankly, districts are doing this. We're shouldering this burden, and it's okay. That's what it is right now. But it would certainly be nice, especially in a case where we have insufficient local matching funds, where we have identified safety hazards. How do you create a situation where you get over that? Because it seems to me if that's really the hurdle here, then something's wrong if we can't find a way to get the funds that are identified in the program to help the districts that don't have their own funds to do this.
And what you may be identifying is, as I kind of indicated earlier, this is a bigger issue than for the $199.5 million, and therefore I think incumbent upon you and school districts to make sure that besides Senator Hancock, other legislators are aware of this as they look at potential future programs and bond funding and provide that direction. Because we're not going to resolve the issue here.
But here's the problem that we face, or here's what I see as a problem, besides all the other ones. If there's all these 77 buildings, and you go out and 3/4 of them say, well, I'd do it except I don't have state matching funds, and essentially what's going to happen is this money will not be expended for seismic safety. It will stay in a pot, and eventually, when we run out of new construction funds, it'll go, because remember, it's a subset of new construction, right, in the program? Isn't this 10% of the reserved new construction amount? So as soon as we run out of new construction, Gary's going to go, wait a minute, just move that right over and fund those new schools. And so what we're doing is we're essentially creating, there's a catch-22. We have no way to participate, no way for the program to go forward. We've identified all the buildings that will potentially qualify, but they can never be funded because there's no state matching funds, so the funds will go away.
Chris?
One, since this is under the facility hardship, is there a potential for a loan component to school districts?
No, there is no mechanism to allow for loans under that program. It is a 50-50 program unless you're a district qualified for financial hardship. So I think, again, under the current structure of the program, within the statute, there is no mechanism for the state to pay for 100% of the project unless the district qualifies as a financial hardship.
Dennis and Fred?
So you're saying that if a district does qualify for financial hardship, then the district's portion would come out of new construction?
It would be the state would pay for the local match.
And not out of the facility facility hardship is funded out of new construction.
Yes.
Okay.
And Fred, then Mamie? Yeah.
Depending on whether it could be a replacement project, it could be a rehabilitation project, so it just depends on what type of project, but there is no facility hardship pot of money.
Yeah. Dennis, go ahead.
I just want to build on that. I'm trying to think through real quickly the qualifications for the facility hardship, for financial hardship. But if a district doesn't have any new construction eligibility and they're coming in for this, do they know, first of all, that if they have a seismic project and they don't have local resources that they can apply for financial hardship? Do districts know this?
They, even for facility hardship, again, seismic zone facility hardship, there is a component that you have to demonstrate a need, depending on the building. But districts can come in and request a conceptual approval for a facility hardship. For financial hardship, they have to meet all the requirements. Right now we have, and actually in the last board meeting, we had a couple of projects that are conceptual approvals. They can start the process of finding out whether they're financial hardship. Now, the conceptual, again, is just the concept. They have 18 months to come in with an actual funding application. At that point, their project, the district's financials, is going to have to be reviewed to see if they qualify for financial hardship. So there's a conceptual component that could be applied. The district could find out at that point, hey, are we financial hardship? But then when they come in with the actual set of plans, an in-depth review is going to have to be conducted to find out if they're actually qualified.
Okay, Fred?
And whether it's reimbursement or a loan, there have been facility hardships that have been conditional upon return of insurance money, federal grants, so there may be some definitional that it's not a loan, it's reimbursement from a district at some point. So there may be some room to work through that.
Mamie?
Yes, question. If you're one of the 77 identified buildings and you move out, the district moves their students out, they're not going to occupy it, does that building go away on the eligibility list? Or as capacity? Does it go away so that you gain eligibility? You got 100 kids in there. Do you now have 100 kids worth of eligibility?
Okay. First, it depends on the building type. For the capacity, we only count classrooms. If we're talking about classrooms, right now there isn't a mechanism to remove that classroom from the capacity, even though the students aren't being housed there.
Even if it's been deemed imminent health and safety?
There's a fix needed.
If they qualify for facility hardship, I'll have to check, actually. I'll have to check on that.
Yeah, we'll follow back up on that.
That's patently unfair. So, hopefully we could ask OPSC to think about how this fits into the facility hardship program, and if DSA is essentially addressing this issue and saying one of the biggest problems is districts without local matching funds, and so they're volleying across the net to OPSC. How can you help people understand ways that we could make this work? And is there any way we could make it work? What would it take to come up with a program that would essentially help to bridge that gap within the context of the facility hardship program, especially? I know you don't have to
provide local funds. Is that what you're asking, Bill?
We're a state, and we're identifying a problem, and we've identified buildings that have collapse potential, and then we go out to the district and say, why aren't you doing it? And they say, we have no money, and the state has $200 million being unused. That's a problem.
I understand the issue, Bill, and really I think that there's nothing that we can do right now within the current structure of the statute to
maybe you could identify. I mean, what I saw was a senator who was clearly frustrated, maybe doesn't understand some of these issues that we're talking about right now.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I probably don't understand them as well as you do. So I think if you could help to put the discussion out there about what the situation is and what could be, so if you say, okay, this would require legislation, that's fine. I mean, just make it clearer what the issue is, because I don't think that the insufficient local matching funds piece has been identified to the board.
And on that, I actually had a question to ask you, Kathy, if we could get a summary of the information you got back from the districts for you to come back on this premise so that we can share and understand, what is the information that's being used to come to this.
Juan, was this us or was this OPSC?
No, I think this was an OPSC survey that we did. And this information is based on the results that we got from the survey.
When was
we
that
can go
survey
back.
done?
Madam
again?
Chair, I was
Am
actually proposing, actually not proposing, I instructed my own staff to give me massive details on all of those buildings that are currently eligible so that we can look at what local funds they've had, what eligibility they have, so I could come back and report to you. So I told them that I wanted it to be ready for March, so we will bring something back to you with lots of details about what's there.
I think that helps frame the discussion. I really appreciate that. I think that is something that with educating the board and having that discussion, we can
So, and
look
remember
at the
though,
big
I'm
picture.
focusing on those that currently
Yes.
meet the criteria that we're aware of. And that's not to say, by the way, that there aren't buildings, there are probably buildings that meet the criteria that we don't know about. So we've also sort of also gone over the 199.5, but we've done the best estimating that we can to stay within those parameters. But we will look at all those details.
Because I think in framing this issue for something that will be beneficial to the board, if knowing that we're requesting to stay within the 199, let's just say $200 million, and that DSA has identified approximately 77 projects, to make sure that we use that money as we go forward, I think let's limit it to the discussion of those 77 projects. Are they moving forward? Because we already know there's highlighted bigger issues. We already know the program as it exists is not addressing, which I think, Bill, you brought up, and financial hardship and how does it all mesh. But right now, the big issue is that $200 million, and we've got to be able to get that $200 million out, and what can we do to facilitate
What I was hoping to do was identify with some kind of precision what the real hurdles those school districts that are out there already face, for real.
And then I think that'll allow the SAB to provide direction on how we might want to resolve that. Yes, Lee?
Just a quick question, I may have missed it. So if a district's eligible, or a building is eligible for seismic, this program, does a district have to be eligible for new construction or modernization as well?
No.
Or it's just totally separate? Okay.
It's separate.
Okay, thank you.
Again, it falls under the facility hardship. And there is a demonstrated need component, and I'll have to clarify exactly what that is. I'll bring back, but I'll get some information. I'll provide it at the next meeting. Clarify.
So it has, wait.
The building has to be.
The building has to house
students.
So an
and staff.
MP room, a multipurpose room, does not, a library does not qualify.
I'd feel more comfortable getting some more information from my staff and bringing it back next month. I don't want to send erroneous information.
Good, thank you.
Bill?
Well,
and then Mary.
the future discussion.
If I might point out,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
San Ramon's project is a gym,
Is a gym,
and they've
that's
come in.
Okay.
Just to clarify.
Future steps to think about and for this program, because obviously or a program like this, and it was brought up before, this really is a function of modernization, and for our district, and for, I assume, for every other district, when we do a modernization project that's a large scope of work in an existing school building, we always do seismic upgrades. That's just part of the reality of the project. You can't get through DSA without doing it. I mean, if you go in there and you don't show new collectors and drag struts and all the foundations and all the shear walls that you're putting in, you'll just never get out of DSA, okay? And so that's where, in the future, our funding should be directed as a supplementary grant for seismic mitigation that would go in to be a part of each district's modernization of their existing facilities, because there is a need to keep strengthening the buildings, and that's, I think, it's too bad that the program didn't focus on that the way it was done originally, but I think that's, in the future, something that we should keep in mind as we go forward.
And Mary, did you have any more comments? Okay, Lee?
Bill, and I agree with that, except that it just cut out those districts that don't have any eligibility. If you tie it to, you have to have eligibility.
Any further discussion or looking at how to frame this issue? I foresee a discussion at the SAB, and then it may not make it back to the April, depending on the SAB discussion, but I foresee it coming back to the implementation committee again for further discussion. So let's just keep it tentative on the April IMP, but I think it really is dependent on Senator Hancock talking to the chair, and if it then gets on the agenda for March, and what direction we receive from the State Allocation Board on further discussion on this. Yes, Bill?
Well, I mean, this is not directed at you, Kathy, but
It never is.
I just want to reflect on this. We've talked about this for, what, 3 years? A long time. The internal deliberations of DSA and OPSC and Department of Finance have been extremely opaque. And we have never been able to part the curtain of discussion. School districts have never been asked to participate in a stakeholder discussion regarding this. We've never been invited once in 3 years to a meeting to talk about it, unlike many, many other programs in the state that we have as part of our school facilities program. I can certainly respect the fact that there needs to be very discrete discussions when you're talking about student safety, but part of the reason this program doesn't work is that nobody talks to school districts about it. And so what I would also recommend is that we have a stakeholder working group, not unlike the one that's meeting on Monday for the High Performance Schools Grant Program. If you include school districts in the process and in setting things up and talking about things in informal stakeholder sessions and meetings, it means there's less contentious debate a lot of times in these kinds of settings and at the board. It's never been done as part of seismic mitigation, and it's just beyond me why.
I guess with that recommendation, what are the thoughts of the fellow implementation committee members, as the board would ask if there was consensus on asking the board on this? Is there consensus? What? We have consensus? Because they will ask me, so I will see that we have that included, that this was a consensus item reached at the implementation committee to ask for a larger discussion on this. So I think, yes, Chris.
Well, I would say a larger discussion within the context of the next round of bond negotiations.
I think it's valid to have a discussion on seismic safety with the current program, what we'd want the future program, if there is one, have a discussion, and we can figure out from the board how we frame the issue.
Sure, and if we're doing that, then I'd just like it mentioned and a reminder placed that it's to be within the $199.5 million that was allocated for the program.
We all have religion.
So, Mamie, yes.
Yeah, isn't another part of the discussion really how to get that 190-something million out there working, solving the problem?
Oh, yeah, no. That's already going to be included. So this was just added on. That was part of my previous summarization. So this is just another one being added on to that one.
I just want to clarify. I was under the impression that the work group was going to be to discuss this particular assignment from the board.
Oh.
Maybe that's a question.
Well, then I think it could be, how about,
I'm not
well,
sure
what
I
is,
understand.
what would the charge of the working group be? Bill, remind me?
Well, I think the fundamental issue is just what Mamie said, is that we have a program that's not working right now. Can we get involved in the discussion of trying to figure out ways to make this program work?
Because that's what I thought was a larger charge, so not specifically DSA's analysis of being able to find and look at
that's
things,
a part
but
of it, though.
it's a component, so it's the bigger issue. Yeah, one.
Just to follow up on that, and I'm not against forming any work group, but I think that we need to give an opportunity for the regulations that the board just recently approved to see if they do encourage further participation. The board just approved regulations in August of 2009 to open it up. I don't know if it's a bit premature to start talking about other changes. Maybe we can wait to see if it works.
And I would note that the regulations were approved in August, but that doesn't mean they go into effect in August. So generally, there's a 3 to 4 month lag before those become effective.
So are they in effect?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, Kathy?
So I was hoping that the more finite research on those projects that are currently eligible would help stimulate some meaningful discussion with the board and other things before we go too far off on a work group that's focused on increasing the participation in the program as it exists. Let's figure out what's causing those that are currently eligible to not move forward, so that so it's not all conceptual, but let's talk about the details that these particular school districts face.
And I think that was, in my mind, maybe not clearly stated. What I was thinking is hearing from DSA, looking at those 77 projects, may be able to form the discussion if the board decided they wanted a stakeholder group to then move forward based on the information that was presented.
Point of clarification, Juan, I did commit you to a large part of this because I don't have access to the eligibility. I want to give you full scope of the picture of...
Sorry, Juan, I tried to keep OPSC out of it today.
Yeah.
Rob?
Not so lucky.
And then just in terms of a report to the board or discussion to the board, was there consensus between all of us on carving out the $200,000 necessary for DSA from the bond to do the study work they need to do?
Yeah, what is the feedback on that?
I mean, I'm for that, and I know Bill.
I would be very supportive of asking the board to set aside a very small amount of these funds to do a study that could help us to identify the collapse potential issues and focus on how we can do that. So.
Assuming it's legal, it's within the bond
assuming it's
covenants
legal
and all
within
that
the
good
bond,
stuff.
yeah, within the bond.
Chris?
I would note, though, that at previous discussions, Lyle with LA Unified indicated a displeasure for using the seismic funds for reports.
Well, if Lyle disagrees.
Actually, there's another.
Yeah, Kathy.
Have another option. That is, the Seismic Safety Commission put aside $200,000 to do the structural study. So another opportunity is to see if the Seismic Safety Commission is willing to change that and have that money be used to do the ranking and stuff that we're proposing, rather than take away any of the $199.5 million.
That'd be great.
I think we should pursue that first. See if we can access and use that money for that purpose before we dip into the limited amount of seismic funds available.
And I want to just mention that. I know the point was brought up that the first district who doesn't get funded because we use that money, but if nobody's getting funded because we're not going to use that money, we need to do it. And as the senator said, somebody's going to get hurt, if not killed. And I know my little cliche thing, we're here for kids, but that's why we're here.
Chris?
And I just want to abstain on the consensus.
Actually, it's funny, Chris, I had written that down.
Of course, we always have to review workload justification before we can approve funding, so I'd always have to make that contingent on the perspective of finance.
Absolutely. Lee?
Just a clarification, I guess I have a question, Kathy. What was exactly the scope of that study? Again, I just want to clarify, because it sounded like some people thought it was perspective out there in future, but I think you were just talking about those.
I think once we do establish so we're going to reach out to seismic experts that we've used in the past, some of them that helped us come up with the definition for the most vulnerable buildings, and some of the others that help create the reference standards that Bill referred to earlier, to come up with a methodology for reviewing what we have in these buildings and then creating a ranked order for them, so the most likely to collapse. Then you could apply. So we're proposing to apply that to the buildings that have already been identified that meet the criteria for the $199.5 million. But once that methodology is there, it's there. You can then apply it as much as you have time, and I think to the extent that you do it for the first group, you can use that as a basis for projections of how it might apply to further workload. So it becomes a basis that you can use when you're looking at future bond negotiations.
Could I follow up?
Sure,
Lisa?
absolutely.
Thank you, and I think that's great, because then you've got a methodology. I'm just confused on the write-up. We keep talking either 77 or 25. So if you've identified that 77 we don't need to deal with, essentially, or they're gone, they're not being used, they're demolished?
I'm not up to speed on the numbers. Juan, do you know that the OPSC report, the larger cover issue that I saw, actually had the whole analysis been done? I've come on board shortly here and covered a whole lot of issues very quickly, so I'm faking it.
Okay, I guess because I don't think we should spend money on 77 facilities if they're not around or being used.
No, it would only be whatever the number of buildings is that's currently eligible for the criteria.
Okay.
Yeah, Dennis?
In terms of the study, I'm just concerned, and I'm a little bit confused about what the scope of that study is, but DSA spent almost 2 years coming up with the regulations the way they are, doing a study in terms of a methodology and how to apply, how to qualify, et cetera, et cetera. Why do we need further studies? What additional information do we need other than all the work that has been done in the past?
Yeah, Richard. Sure. Go ahead, Richard. Oh, Richard, Mike.
That was to determine the building types and the number thereof?
Right.
Not the specific evaluation of a particular building to see its susceptibility to an earthquake. It was a generalization, not the AB 300. The thousands of projects that were reviewed.
Yes.
That was done on a broad, the 50,000 foot view. Then you broke down, and the criteria was developed based on whether it's a pre-76 tilt-up building, unreinforced masonry.
No, I understand that, but all the regulations that were put in place established a process for structural review of each one of those projects that qualified, and what would have to be done with DSA. So why do we need more information?
This is an attempt to determine, like I said, a ranking, so that the most susceptible is addressed, the most critical is addressed first.
I'm just concerned that each one of those projects is unique. And it's unique in terms of its design, unique in terms of its location, its proximity to a fault. I think to try and come up with a methodology that is ranking those is going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, and just will extend the time out in getting this money out to the project.
Well, not necessarily,
that's my
but
I think that I'm looking at using this as a way to forecast the need in the future more so. I'm looking at figuring out ways to increase participation in the existing program with the information that I'm coming back on the existing buildings that meet the criteria, and let's have some meaningful, the best way to increase participation, let's have some meaningful discussion about those that are currently eligible that aren't coming forward, and let's understand what the real hurdles are and take it from there.
Yeah, I think if I look at, Dennis, to me, the most important phrase is in the sentence that starts on the first page, the advantage of this approach is that if it is applied to a group of buildings, say all school facilities in areas with ground shaking potential in excess of 1.5 G, the analysis could rank buildings by risk, considering the strengths and vulnerabilities of the structure and ground shaking potential at the site without limitation by structural type or system. That's the key phrase, without limitation by structural type or system. In other words, if a building is going to collapse, what the hell does it matter what kind of structural system it has? So, and so this is beyond the category that we now have. So I'm agreeing with Kathy that this is kind of a little bit of this study is looking forward to say, what is the scope of the potential problem here that we might face?
And I think just to clarify, as how I was viewing this of what DSA would be doing is it wouldn't hold up those 77 projects or delay or anything. It would develop a methodology of looking at them when we clarify how do we view things, what standards do we look at, and have it kind of look outside the current scope of the program of how we're defining things to expand it, which then once you develop that methodology, the board can say it doesn't apply to these 77 projects. We already got them. We figure them out. We got to figure out how to get that $199 million out. But let's use those 77 projects for the ability to create that methodology. And then once that methodology exists, you can then, therefore, when we go forward, assuming that there is another bond, assuming that seismic safety is put into it, this creates a basis of discussion of the bigger picture of, is this a way to maybe improve the program, and how we look and resolve some of the issues. That was kind of my understanding of what this would potentially do. Am I off? Am I right?
Nope, you're right. And after a year and a half on tour with Fleet, I'm forgetting how carefully I have to say everything that comes to you guys. I am now reminded, so I'll be careful.
Lee?
Again, I'm sorry we're beating this to death, Kathy, sorry. Easier to deal with cars. Huh?
Oh, no, it's not.
Maybe not. Okay.
I think I'd rather fight over this. Thank you very much.
it seems like the scope is two pieces, because you do say, we want to get to the real hurdles that the districts are facing.
But the scope, that issue that I'm talking about right now, something assignment that I just took on. I've already directed my staff to do this. I just hoodwinked Juan into helping me with the other piece of it. So we're going to do that independently, and we want to do it within the next month. What we're talking about is a study going forward. It's completely separate from that.
Okay, so that I needed to have that clarified. So you're already committed to doing that, not part of the $200,000 study?
Correct, that's free.
Okay.
Not really, they're getting paid. But.
Hey, okay, thank you.
Yes. Any other discussion, public comment? Public comment, seeing and hearing none. Kathy, thank you so much. Welcome back in front of, OPSC issues and the implementation committee. Hope that you didn't feel too beat up. But I also want to, at this time, now open it up to potential suggestions of future agenda items. Seeing and hearing none. Oh, Lee.
I don't know whether I can do this since I'm the first. This is my first.
You can
meeting.
do whatever you want, and then I'll tell you yes or no.
Bill kind of mentioned it. It does kind of open up the Pandora's box, but the whole idea of baseline, and we just mentioned it in the seismic program. That is a very small bit of the whole problem of districts not being able to adjust their baseline. And I know it's a huge, huge issue. Well, at least we hear it's a huge, huge issue. And so I would put that forward.
And stuff that we put forward, I would always appreciate kind of like a little background issue rule analysis conclusion that I call, to frame the issue so that we would know kind of to expedite whether using OPSC time, and is that an issue, and reaching out to school districts to find, is that something that there's further discussion we want on it.
Is that the task of the person who suggests?
Yes.
All right. Okay. Yes. All right.
Yeah, we're a little slim on staff over here, so, if you bring it up, I might task it back at you. Seeing and hearing that, thank you so much. I appreciate the conversations that we've had. And, for the first subject item, there's going to be a report back to the board kind of on the discussion to frame it, and then the SAB kind of tells us what they want to do. So I forgot to mention that in my summarization when I kind of hit the criteria of the issues, that there will be a report to the board, and then the board can decide what they want to do with the information. So, thank you. Have a wonderful Thursday.